On August 2nd, 1963, 4-year-old Bobby Panknin, along with his 2 older brothers and his 2 parents, headed off to a camping resort on Deep Lake in Washington state. The following day, Mrs. Panknin, whose name was Edna, decides she wants to take her 3 sons down a logging road that was right behind their campsite that she had heard fed out to this beautiful little waterfall that she thought her sons would like to see. Edna gets the boys ready, she says bye to Mr. Panknin, and then she and her sons take off down this logging road. And as soon as she's on the road, it occurs to her that it's totally overgrown. The grass is really high, it's rocky and bumpy, and she's thinking to herself, there's no way any vehicle is getting down this road. And probably there's been no vehicles on this road for a very long time. This is a very isolated place on this campsite. So they walk for a little ways on this overgrown logging road until they see there's a turnoff that leads down to the water and this little waterfall. And so right away she saw there was all this brush they were going to need to walk through, and the ground looked pretty rough. And Bobby, her youngest, the 4-year-old, he didn't have shoes on. He was going through a phase where he refused to wear shoes. And so it hadn't really mattered the entire duration of walking up the road, but it seemed like this might be too much for him to walk on. And so she told Bobby to wait on the road, and she told her other son, Jimmy, the 6-year-old, to wait next to him. Those two would stay on the road together, while she and Bill, the 10-year-old, would go past the brush, go down to the water, check it out for a couple of minutes, and then she would come back, she would pick up Bobby, and Jimmy would come along, and then they would go down and look at the water, and then they would leave. Bobby didn't seem to mind, so he just sat on the road, and Jimmy was a little bit frustrated that he couldn't go with the first group, but he sat down too, and Bill and Edna took off past this brush down to the water. Now, the distance between where Bill and Edna and where Bobby and Jimmy were was only about 10 feet. There was just this brush right in the middle of them that did obscure their view. They could not see each other, but they are very close to each other. And so Jimmy is sitting next to Bobby, and he's getting increasingly more and more restless. He wants to go down and look at the waterfall. He wants to be down there with his older brother and his mom. And so at some point, he just can't take it anymore. And Jimmy does something that to this day, he regrets every single day. And that is, he got up and left his brother. He went through the brush down to where Bill and Edna were. And as soon as Edna saw him, she was mad at him, and she goes, "What? You left Bobby up there? Come on." And so they turned around after about 60 seconds and went right back up. And when they got back, Bobby was gone. And at first, they're not like, oh my goodness, someone's abducted Bobby, because there's no one on this road. They'd come up here and recognize that it's very remote, it's isolated, there's no cars that come through here, they hadn't heard anything. And so their first instinct was, okay, he probably got up, and is behind a tree, or he walked down the hill over here, or he's nearby. And so they're yelling for him, they're walking around, and no one's panicking yet. In fact, really, Edna was just annoyed with Jimmy that he had left, Bobby, and that he's to blame right now, but it's just an inconvenience at this point. But after a couple of minutes, when they can't get Bobby to yell back where he is, they start to realize they might have a problem here. And so Edna becomes more panicked, and she's yelling at the top of her lungs for her son. She's having her other 2 sons go look down by the water, go look over there, but there's no trace of him. And they can't believe it. It didn't make any sense because, he's 4, he's got no shoes on, they didn't hear anything. How could he be gone? But he was gone. And so finally, after a couple of minutes, Edna rounded up her other 2 boys, and they ran all the way back to the campsite where they got Mr. Panknin, and they hailed the police, and very quickly, a big search was launched up on that logging road. As soon as the police arrived, the first thing they did is they pressed Edna and the other 2 boys about, what did you hear? You had to have heard something. He was only 10 feet away from you, and he was within earshot of you, certainly. What did you hear? Did a vehicle come through? Did you hear an animal? Did you hear anybody talking? And Edna and the other 2 boys, they swore that they heard nothing, that they're just as baffled by it as anybody else. And so the police really didn't have a good starting point of where Bobby could have gone. And in that area, there wasn't any, steep drop-offs or obvious places that Bobby could have fallen into or gotten trapped. The water for the waterfall, it's not deep. It's this little tiny brook. It'd be difficult to drown in that little brook. So they just basically started fanning out in all directions, hoping they would, find a piece of clothing or some other clue that would indicate where he went. After 3 days of searching that yielded nothing, they finally brought in a bloodhound to try to find him based on scent. And so they had the dog smell one of Bobby's shoes, and the dog immediately seemed to key in on his scent in the area where Bobby had gone missing. And the dog turns and starts running up the logging road away from the campsite, so farther into the forest. And it runs for almost 2 miles, and it never seems to waver. It's clearly picked up Bobby's scent. and it stops at this fork in the road about 2 miles away from where Bobby had gone missing. And it keys in on this one area right at the fork where there wasn't anything significant. It was just this bare patch of dirt. And so the police, they uncover the dirt a little bit. There's nothing there. They're looking around the area. That there's no indication that Bobby was ever here. So they give the scent back to the dog. And again, the dog just keeps tracking to this one section in this fork in the road. But they didn't know what to do with that information because there was nothing there. The search for Bobby was called off after 7 days because they could not find anything. And so the lead investigator came out and did this press release where he basically said, "We have no idea what happened to Bobby. However, we do think he was abducted." And his reasoning for this was pretty straightforward. Bobby was a young kid that had no shoes on in an unfamiliar forest, and he was only out of eyesight for 2 minutes. So how far could he really have gotten? Certainly not far enough that his family wouldn't have found him after those 2 minutes were up and they began looking for him. And so if you go down the abduction rabbit hole, you start with, okay, a person must have taken Bobby. But for a person to take Bobby, that means a person had to be in this area that was super isolated and remote, and they hadn't seen anybody in the area, and there were very few campers at the campsite. So realistically, if a person was going to abduct Bobby, they had to have been planning it and had to have been hiding in the trees and were stalking this family until they got to that spot where Jimmy left Bobby, and then this person, runs out of the tree line, runs over to Bobby, picks him up without Bobby making a sound, he muffles him, and he runs away into the woods carrying this child, all in a 2-minute window, which was a totally abrupt window. It wasn't like this obvious thing that Bobby was going to be left alone. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which would have been a deterrent, you would think, if someone was trying to abduct Bobby. But nonetheless, this window presents itself and this person runs down and takes Bobby. It just seems like that person would need to be really fixated on Bobby, one, and there wasn't a clear reason for why anyone would be very fixated on Bobby or this family. And two, they would need to be very strong and quick and agile, more than the average person. So we're talking like a professional athlete level of agility and physical fitness. And so while it's certainly possible that a professional athlete had been stalking this family and then ran down in this tiny little window of time and stole Bobby away without getting detected and then evaded the law for 7 days in the middle of the woods, while that's possible, it's pretty unlikely. And investigators reached this conclusion. They thought, it does seem pretty unlikely that a person did this. So they moved on to animals and they said, okay, maybe a bear took Bobby. And so they brought out bear sniffing dogs to search the area for signs that a bear had been there. And there hadn't been. And so they said, okay, maybe a cougar had been there. And so they brought out a cougar expert who looked around the area, and there's no signs of a cougar in the area. Plus, there was no blood anywhere around the area where Bobby had been taken. There was no drag marks where if a predator were to grab you, they would need to drag you away. There was no drag marks. So it seemed like, okay, the large predator theory also has problems with it. And so the next theory offered up was, well, maybe a giant eagle swooped down and picked Bobby up and flew him away, which would account for why maybe it was quiet and there was no drag marks, there was no blood, and why he's just gone. But that was when authorities said, okay, we clearly have no clue. And so that's why they gave the press release and basically said, we just don't know. And so while we probably will never know what happened to Bobby, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent, it was fast, it was strong, it was agile, and it had been watching that family. Because as soon as that 2-minute window presented itself, where Jimmy was gone and Bobby was vulnerable, it swept in so fast that no one heard it, no one saw it, and it took Bobby somewhere and did something to him. And whatever it did, it probably wasn't good. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they are just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point, they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map, and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But I mean, they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before when they were up in the tree, even then it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline, and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, and he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge. And he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the two older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the two girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes, they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking we're gonna find her. So they go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now, this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking, and so they call the police. The police show up, and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to this swamp, and they have thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl, and once again, there's nothing. Then on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. They found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves. That's what killed her. But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased because they would have been able to pick around the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals. But Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located. And so they followed the drag line into this meadow and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. And investigators said it looked like something big had been laying there. And they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with two theories that didn't really make any sense. The first one was, okay, these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belong to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off, and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. One, that this giant person even existed, and two, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans, so that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really, they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, how did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what. In June of 2011, I had just failed a very stressful and anxiety-inducing underwater test as part of Navy SEAL training. And after I failed this test, my instructor told me to get out of the pool and go over to the corner with the other failures. And so I made my way to the edge of the pool, I climbed out, and I sulked my way to the corner where I saw my other classmates who had met a similar fate on this test. They were all sitting in the corner with their backs to the pool in neat rows. And so I was totally gassed from this test. And so when I sat down, I started dramatically breathing really loud and heaving my chest up and down to show off just how hard my test had been. And about 2 seconds into this ridiculous performance of mine, one of my other classmates who had been sitting in the corner when I showed up, a big 18-year-old kid from Wisconsin named Matos, he immediately turned around and made eye contact with me, and through gritted teeth, he just goes, "Shut up! Everybody here is in pain." And then he turned back around. And immediately, I was actually really mad at him because he just totally publicly dimed me out in front of my other classmates. But then it dawned on me, he was right. The job we were trying out for, Navy SEAL, they're not looking for people who just feel bad for themselves all the time. And so I never forgot the lesson Matos taught me on the pool deck that day. And I, along with everybody else in the SEAL teams, never forgot the totally insane thing that Matos did 5 years later that was picked up by virtually every major news network at the time. Back in 2012, so about a year after our exchange on the pool deck, Ephraim and I graduated and became Navy SEALs. I was assigned to an East Coast SEAL team and he was assigned to a West Coast one. And over the next 5 years, I never saw the guy until I saw him on TV. It was mid-June 2017, and I was on base in Virginia in an office full of other Navy SEALs, and we were wrapping up for the day. I was closing my email and powering down my computer, and I noticed my phone that was sitting on the table suddenly started lighting up with all these text messages from current and former teammates. And so I grabbed my phone, and all the messages said the same thing: turn on the news. And so in this office we were in, there was always a TV that was turned to the news sitting in the corner that was on mute. And so I turned to look at this TV, and on the TV from a distance, all I can see is breaking news and Middle East. And so given our profession, news like that tended to have a direct impact on our day-to-day lives. And so I assumed all these text messages must be about whatever happened in the Middle East. And so I get up, I walk over, I grab the remote, and on my walk back to my seat, I'm turning the volume up, and everybody else in the room is turning around to watch the TV as well. And we start hearing the TV reporters talking about this group of American civilians that had gone to Iraq and taken up arms against the terrorist organization ISIS. And so as they're talking about this group of American civilians, they put on the screen an image of one of these Americans. It was this big bearded guy in his mid-20s carrying an AK-47 rifle standing behind a tank somewhere in the Middle East. And as soon as I saw that picture, I knew right away why I had gotten that flurry of text messages from current and former teammates. It's because we all know this guy. The guy on TV was Ephraim Matos. 5 years earlier, after our graduation, Ephraim checked into his first SEAL team out on the West Coast, and very quickly after he showed up, they deployed to Afghanistan. During one of their missions, Ephraim was in the back of his patrol as they walked across this huge open field as they left this village they had just been in. And so Ephraim, in virtue of being in the back of the patrol, was in charge of looking behind the unit and make sure no one was coming after them. And so Ephraim periodically would turn around and he would look and make sure no one was following them. And then at some point when he turned around, he saw two little girls that couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old running out of the village and start running down the road towards them. Now, earlier in the day, when Ephraim and his team had been in that village, they had found a children's backpack lying in the middle of the road. And when they went up to inspect it, it turned out to be rigged with explosives. Now, no one had gotten hurt. They had defused the explosives, but they were very weary for children's backpacks. And so as Ephraim sees these two girls running up to him, he can see they're both wearing similar style backpacks to the one they found in the road. They were suicide bombers. Ephraim began screaming at these girls to stop, go back, don't come any closer, or I'll have to shoot at you. But he could tell they weren't stopping. They were just running up the road. He could see there were tears coming down their face. They were totally upset. They were obviously innocent. They were young kids. They'd been put up to this by the Taliban. But Ephraim, because he was in the rear security of his patrol, he had to deal with them like they were threats. And so at some point when they wouldn't stop, he raised his rifle up, he flipped the gun off safe, and he put his reticle right on one of the girls, and he began applying pressure to his trigger. But right as he was about to squeeze and fire a shot, the girls just abruptly stopped. It's like they knew they were about to be shot. And they turned around and they ran back towards the village. And so Ephraim put his finger off the trigger, he flipped it back on safe, he lowered his rifle, and he breathed a huge sigh of relief. But even though he didn't have to engage these poor girls, that experience totally haunted Ephraim. In fact, of all the combat he got in on that deployment, that experience with those innocent girls had the most impact on him. How could anybody force a child to be a suicide bomber? How could anyone be that cruel? And so by the time Ephraim came back to the United States after that deployment, he had changed. That experience specifically had changed him. Even though he believed in the US government's mission over in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, he felt like he could be doing more for these poor innocent people that were just trapped inside of conflict zones like these two little girls. And so over the next few years, he began looking at different conflict zones all over the world where civilians were in the most danger. And he discovered there was one place that was killing and exploiting civilians at an unprecedented rate. And that place was Iraq, where a new terrorist organization had taken power called ISIS. So in early 2017, when Ephraim's Navy contract ran out and it was time for him to decide if he wanted to stay in the SEAL teams or get out and become a civilian, he opted to not re-enlist, so he left the military, and instead he got on social media and he contacted a foreign volunteer group in Iraq that was providing humanitarian aid to civilians. And he reached out to them and he said, "Hey, can I join you?" And of course, they said, yes, we'd love to have a Navy SEAL come out and support us. And so just a couple of days later, Ephraim sold his house. He packed up a bag of clothes and a backpack. He grabbed his passport and he hopped on a plane and he flew to northern Iraq all by himself. Now, before we continue the rest of the story, you need to understand just how bold this move was by Ephraim. Now, when he was a Navy SEAL, and so a member of the United States military on active duty, when he went to Afghanistan, to a war zone, he had lots of support. If his team got pinned down by the enemy, they could call in an airstrike or they could call in backup. If Ephraim got hurt on the battlefield or his teammates got hurt on the battlefield, they could call in special medical teams that would fly in virtually any condition to come save them. And if Ephraim got captured by the enemy, you better believe America is coming for him. But in this case, Ephraim went to a war zone as a civilian. He was not in the U.S. military, so he didn't have any of that support. If he or his team got pinned down out in Iraq, they would either have to fight their way out or get killed or captured. If he or one of his new teammates from this volunteer group got hurt, they would have to either save themselves or get killed or captured. And if Ephraim got captured as a civilian, nobody's coming for him. Nobody even knows he's been captured. He is completely on his own. But Ephraim knew these risks. In fact, he knew them better than most people because he had already deployed to a war zone and saw how important it was to have a support infrastructure. So when he flew to Iraq as a civilian, he knew he was hanging it out there, but he just didn't care. He felt like he had a mission to go help these innocent people because nobody else was. When he arrived in Iraq in March of 2017, he was met at the airport by one of the guys from this volunteer group Ephraim was going out to join. He was a very muscular, tattooed American in his mid-30s who introduced himself as Sky, and he said he had been a Marine, and while he was in the Marines, he had deployed to Iraq, so he was familiar with the area. The pair hopped in a vehicle, and Sky drove them to the volunteer group's safe house in the city, where Ephraim got a chance to meet the leader of this group. It was a tough-as-nails former Army Special Forces guy in his mid-50s named Dave. And Dave, for the past several decades, had been going out to conflict zones all over the world, and he would tell Ephraim that the worst atrocities he had seen committed against civilians in any of these places was where they were right now, in Iraq at the hands of ISIS. A few days later, Ephraim, Sky, Dave, and a few other American volunteers loaded up into this convoy made up of armored ambulances, and they left the city and they headed west into the countryside towards a huge city called Mosul that 3 years earlier had been captured by ISIS. On their journey towards the city, Ephraim and the others had to pass through a number of military checkpoints. Now, most of these checkpoints were stood up by their ally, the Iraqi army. But Ephraim and the others knew that they might stumble upon an ISIS checkpoint, and in virtue of all of them being pale-skinned Americans, they would instantly be recognized as the enemy and fired upon. So every time they slowed down for one of these checkpoints, Ephraim and the others would clutch their guns closely and mentally prepare themselves for a potential vicious close-quarters fight to the death. But luckily, they managed to go the entire distance all the way to the outskirts of Mosul without any checkpoint drama. And once they got there, they linked up with an Iraqi army unit that the leader of this volunteer group, Dave, had a relationship with. Over the first month that Ephraim was in country, he worked with this Iraqi army unit to help distribute food and provide medical care to civilians in and around Mosul. Then, in month 2 of his stay in Iraq, everything changed. Iraqi decision makers decided it was finally time to retake Mosul from ISIS. This was a huge military movement that required several units to work together and would take several weeks. The main Iraqi army was going to push inside of the city limits of Mosul and inch by inch reclaim territory from ISIS, while the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with would be responsible for reclaiming some of the villages around Mosul that ISIS had occupied. And so suddenly, Ephraim and the rest of his volunteer group went from being humanitarian aid workers to having a direct frontline combat role with the Iraqi army. And in his first civilian combat experience, Ephraim ran across an active minefield towards this village that was occupied by ISIS. And after nearly being blown up at least 2 times, Ephraim finally made it to this village, and he began going house to house with the other volunteers, clearing them of ISIS fighters. And in one instance that he has on camera, he entered into this structure and he saw there were guns in the ground, and they looked around and they couldn't find any ISIS fighters inside, but they noticed on the ground there was a piece of plywood. They moved it aside and it revealed this huge hole that led down into the ground, and this hole connected to a huge underground tunnel system that ISIS used to escape gunfights just like this one. And so Ephraim and Dave, who was with him, just hopped right down into the tunnel. They didn't have night vision, they didn't have backup, just the two of them start running down this totally pitch black tunnel, periodically throwing grenades ahead of them in case there are ISIS fighters ahead of them. And at some point, after running for quite a while, just getting ready to come in contact with their adversaries, they reach this big, high-ceilinged cavern that's a dead end. And they're looking around thinking, okay, I guess no one ran in here. But before they turned around and left the tunnel system, they looked up with their lights and they saw high up on the wall, dug into the wall, was another entrance to another tunnel. it looked like there needed to be a ladder to get up to this additional tunnel entrance. And so Ephraim and Dave look at each other and they're thinking, I bet ISIS fighters ran down here. There was a ladder. They climbed up and went in that entrance and then pulled the ladder up so we can't follow them. And so Ephraim and Dave couldn't do anything about it. They decide, okay, well, we'll just go out and we'll tell the Iraqi army and see what they want to do. And so Ephraim and Dave, they leave this tunnel system, they go back outside, they tell the Iraqi army, and the Iraqi army brings in a bulldozer and they fill in that entrance they had found inside of the house, completely seal it up so nobody could go in or get out. And then later that night, after that village had been cleared of all ISIS fighters, they began hearing muffled explosions underground near where this entrance to this tunnel was. And what it turned out to be was ISIS fighters that realized they had been buried alive. They had snuck down there. They had used a ladder to get up into that crawl space. But when they realized they were doomed, they blew themselves up. For the next month, Ephraim and the Iraqi army unit that he and his volunteers were working with continued to periodically get into small skirmishes with ISIS in these villages outside of Mosul, but the majority of their time was spent providing humanitarian aid and medical care to civilians in the area. Then in May, their mission changed again. The other Iraqi army units that had been sent directly into Mosul a month earlier to inch by inch eradicate the area of ISIS fighters, they had done a relatively good job, but the last few ISIS fighters had been pushed up into this northern section of the city where they had bunkered down inside of these blown out concrete structures, and they were putting up an unbelievably fierce fight. So fierce, in fact, that these Iraqi army units in the city were not able to go any farther forward. They needed armored vehicles and tanks if they were going to be successful. And it just so happened the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with, that had been outside of Mosul this whole time, they were an armored unit. They had armored vehicles and tanks. And they were ordered to head right into the heart of Mosul and liberate it once and for all. And so on May 4th, Ephraim and the other volunteers loaded up in their armored vehicles and they joined this huge line of dozens and dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles looking at the western side of Mosul. There was just a field between them and the city walls. And as soon as this massive convoy began moving forward towards the city just opened up on them. Heavy machine gun fire, rocket fire, mortars. It was just absolute chaos. ISIS knew they were coming, and so they were unleashing everything they had on them. And Ephraim would say, after his vehicle actually got inside of the city limits of Mosul and was on one of their roads, all these booby-trapped cars began detonating all around them, and the machine gun fire and rocket fire and mortar fire only intensified. At the same time this was happening, Iraqi civilians inside of Mosul saw this unbelievable wave of violence happening, and they began trying to flee the city. Now, ISIS had effectively kept them hostage inside of Mosul because they needed lots of civilians in and around the area because it prevented Iraq and America and other forces that were fighting ISIS from indiscriminately bombing Mosul to get rid of the ISIS presence there. And so when ISIS saw these civilians running away, they began shooting them to deter other civilians from trying to escape. And so right in front of Ephraim, as he's driving into the city, men, women, children are just being gunned down all over the place. Naturally, Ephraim and the other volunteers hopped out and tried to return fire at these ISIS shooters, but they were so well fortified in different structures, they couldn't even see them, let alone hit them. So they did the next best thing. Ephraim and the others began putting themselves out in the open to draw fire on themselves so that other nearby civilians could run to safety. And for the next 3 days, that's what they did, constantly exposing themselves and dodging bullets. And then also when they weren't doing that, they were treating these civilians that had been wounded and other Iraqi soldiers that had been wounded. Now, to this point, Ephraim had seen combat when he was in the United States Navy as a Navy SEAL, and he'd seen combat as a volunteer with this group. But it wasn't until he got inside of Mosul that he saw just how barbaric humans can be to one another. He said he saw so much death and dying all around him that it was like his brain couldn't compute that level of barbarism. He would later write a book called The City of Death, and it was about his experience in Mosul. And he said the reason he named the book The City of Death is because that's what it felt like. Everywhere around him was just death. For the next several weeks, Ephraim and the other volunteers took up a position in the south section of Mosul inside of this bombed out building. They created a sort of aid station, and there they focused all of their attention on trying to treat as many wounded civilians and wounded Iraqi soldiers as they possibly could. At the same time, the rest of the Iraqi army had pushed north and was slowly chipping away at the last few ISIS fighters. On June 1st, so roughly 1 month after Ephraim and the others have entered into the city of Mosul, they noticed a significant uptick in the number of wounded civilians that were coming to them for help. And so all day and all night, they're treating all these people that are horribly wounded with gunshot wounds and other wounds. And so at some point, Ephraim and the others begin asking these people, what happened to you? This seems unusual that so many people would show up with these wounds. And they all just seemed to be in shock. No one was able to really talk about what happened, but a few people mentioned there had been a massacre somewhere nearby. But when they pried for more information, there was a language barrier issue, and there was just the fact that they were overwhelmed with patients, and they needed to make sure their focus was on treating them, not talking to them. The following morning, though, Ephraim and the others got up and decided they wanted to push farther north into ISIS-held territory to see if there was evidence of a massacre, to try to figure out what happened to all these people that were showing up wounded. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers, they left their aid station building and they moved north about 1 block to this huge intersection. And there they tucked up against this huge concrete wall that protected them from ISIS. ISIS was down the other road that ran through the intersection. They were holed up in this huge bombed out hospital that overlooked this intersection. And so from where they were, ISIS couldn't see them and they couldn't shoot them. At some point, Ephraim poked his head around this wall, looking down the road towards this burned out hospital. And what he saw along the road shocked him. There were dozens and dozens of civilians that had been killed laying all over the place. It would turn out the day before, a huge group of civilians had attempted to flee the city, and they ran in front of that burned out hospital where ISIS was, and they gunned them down. And they killed over 200 civilians, men, women, children. They didn't care. And they wounded at least 100 others. And so that was why there was that huge uptick in wounded civilians the day before. And so as Ephraim is scanning this carnage, being careful not to stay exposed for too long, he notices one particularly large pile of bodies. There's about 20 or 30 bodies. He sees in this pile, there's clearly movement. And he can see there is a little girl who's attempting to hide herself under her dead mother's clothing. And then next to this girl were 2 other adult men that clearly were wounded, but were alive. Ephraim immediately starts yelling to them to run to him, you're gonna get killed out there. But the 3 of them were completely shell-shocked. For the past 24 hours, they had been laying inside of this pile of bodies. And so they were not going to be able to move on their own. And so Ephraim realized unless they did something to get them out of there, they were going to die. So Ephraim and the others ran back to their Iraqi army counterparts, and they got them to sign off on a rescue mission. And their plan was they would have one of the Iraqi tanks drive down that road straight towards that hospital where all the ISIS fighters were, and right behind the tank would be an Iraqi Humvee, inside of which would be Ephraim and the other volunteers. And so they would go straight down the road. The tank would serve as a sort of shield for the Humvee, and after the tank passed the pile of dead bodies, the Humvee would be lined up right next to it. Ephraim and the others would hop out, they'd grab the girl and the 2 other men, pull them back in the Humvees, and then the 2 vehicles would back up to safety. Once this plan was in place, Ephraim and Dave and the other volunteers contacted the American military in the area, and they got them to authorize a smoke screen. They would fire artillery shells with airburst smoke grenades that would obscure the view of the ISIS fighters in the hospital. They wouldn't actually be able to see the tank or the Humvee or this rescue operation taking place right in front of them. And so shortly after these plans are totally finalized and Ephraim and the others are loading up in the Humvee and they're getting in position to turn that corner and begin this operation, the driver of the Humvee says, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. It's not safe. I'm not willing to do it. Ephraim and the other volunteers tried to convince him to still do the operation because they didn't have time to get a replacement Humvee, and they had already coordinated with the American artillery units that were going to be firing these shells at a certain time, and so they really didn't have an opportunity to do this operation again if this guy backed out. Not to mention, if they didn't get out there quickly, these 3 people were going to die anyways. And so finally, when Ephraim realized this driver was not going to budge, he was not going to go in this operation, Ephraim and the others got out of the Humvee and they walked up to the tank driver and they asked him, are you still prepared to go on this rescue operation? And he said he was. And so even though if they went through with this mission, it would mean Ephraim and the others would be on foot behind the tank, completely exposed, they were still totally down for doing it. In fact, Ephraim would say at no point did they consider canceling the mission. They were so focused on saving these 3 people that they were prepared to sacrifice themselves to do it. And so the tank driver closed his this hatch. Ephraim and the others got behind the tank. They turned that corner so they're facing the hospital. And then a couple minutes later, as planned, American artillery launched these airburst smoke grenades that totally obscured ISIS's view. And as soon as those smoke clouds were in the air, ISIS came out and just started firing randomly straight down in the general direction of where this tank was. They couldn't really see the tank. They had no way of knowing what they were doing out there. They just knew something was going on. And so meanwhile, Ephraim and the others are tucked up behind this tank as it's slow rolling in, as rounds are impacting all around them, mortars start landing all around them, and it turns out there were other ISIS fighters, not just directly ahead of them in the hospital, but also off to their side in other buildings. So they were getting hit from two directions. Ephraim remembers, as he was behind this tank trying to stay as small as he could, he began dry heaving because he was so terrified. He was completely convinced he was going to die that day. Eventually, the tank made its way just past this pile of bodies, and at that point, Ephraim actually stepped out and fired back towards ISIS in the hospital and over towards the berm to provide some cover fire, while Dave and another volunteer ran over and pulled the girl and the other two men out of the pile and behind the tank. The girl and one of the men were okay. They were not badly physically hurt, but the other man was badly hurt and he couldn't walk. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim and his team found a piece of sheet metal on the ground behind this tank, and they rolled him onto it and used it like a stretcher and began dragging him as the tank began moving in reverse. And so as bullets are still flying all around them, rockets are landing next to them, they're moving, they're making good progress, when the wounded man slips off of the sled and he lands right in the tracks of where this tank is going to go. And for a variety of reasons, Ephraim and the others had no way of communicating with the tank driver. So the tank driver is just going to keep on moving and he's going to run over this injured man who can't go anywhere. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim leaps down, he grabs the injured guy, and he rolls with him out of the way of the tracks right as it goes past him. But now Ephraim and this wounded man are outside the protection of the tank, and rounds start impacting all around them. The smoke screen at this point is pretty much cleared, and so ISIS sees them. And Ephraim at this point makes a heartbreaking decision. He looks at this guy who he knows cannot move himself. He's badly wounded. He makes eye contact with him. He holds his hand, and Ephraim just shakes his head and says, "I'm sorry," because he knew he couldn't move him fast enough behind the tank before both of them got shot, and he couldn't throw him on his back in time before both of them got shot. And so he had to leave him. And so Ephraim jumped up, he leapt behind the tank right as a volley of fire hit right where he had been standing, and then Ephraim and the others continued moving back. That wounded man would go on to be killed by ISIS. Only a few moments after Ephraim was back behind the relative safety of the tank, he suddenly fell to the ground and felt a pain in his right leg. He had been shot through the leg. But where he fell was right in line with where one of these tank treads were coming. But again, they can't talk to this tank, so they can't stop the tank from running him over. And so a surge of adrenaline came over Ephraim, and he leapt up onto his feet and just continued hobbling behind the tank despite this gaping hole in his leg. Eventually, they made it all the way back to that intersection where they had started, but the only way they could get back down the alleyway to safety with the Iraqi army was to run across a small segment of this street. Basically, you needed to be exposed for just a second running across. But at this point, the smoke screen was gone. ISIS knew exactly where they were, and they were waiting for them to pop out from behind that tank. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers are screaming across this gap in the road towards the Iraqi army to get them to send an armored vehicle across this road, pick us up, and bring us back across. We can't run across this gap without getting shot. But because of the chaos and the noise, the tank is firing, there's mortars, there's rockets, there's gunfire, it's crazy, the message was just not received. And so in a sudden fit of madness and frustration and fear and all sorts of things, Ephraim just runs across the street. And he gets to the other side miraculously without being hit again. And there he tells the Iraqi army, send an armored Humvee across this gap, get the girl, get the guy, get the rest of the volunteers, save them. Seconds later, an armored Humvee crossed that gap. They picked them up and brought them back. And at this point, Ephraim is now lying on the ground behind that concrete wall. So he's relatively safe, and he's getting his leg bandaged up. And he remembers when the girl and the guy were brought out and they were safe and alive, the Iraqi army erupted in cheers. It was this unbelievably happy moment in an absolutely tragic, horrible time. The Iraqis would transport Ephraim in an armored ambulance to an aid station south of where this intersection was, and there they would put him on a cot, and a doctor would rebandage his leg, and then he would walk away. And so Ephraim is left inside of this room to kind of think about what had just happened, and he looked over to his left, and just 2 beds over from him was the girl he had just nearly died saving. And she was sitting on her cot. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking straight ahead. Her dark hair was matted down, and she was just kind of staring into nothingness. It was clear she was still in shock, but she did look relatively unhurt. And then at some point, another Iraqi doctor came over and gave her some food and water, and she ate and drank ferociously. Ephraim just stared at her in awe. At that moment, she was the most important thing in his life. And as he's staring at this miracle child, the doctor that had given her food and water noticed him staring, and he came over to Ephraim and he just said, "Her name is Demoa. She's 4 years old and she's going to be just fine." After the doctor had walked away, Ephraim pulled his hat down over his face and he just wept. Ephraim never had a chance to actually speak to Demoa because she was so scared of everyone around her that he decided to just give her her space. But he would later find out that she was reunited with her living family members, and today she is alive and well. After his injury, Ephraim was sent back to the United States, and it was then that he learned their rescue operation had been filmed by a guy who was there that day documenting war crimes by ISIS. He saw this rescue operation happening, and he just started filming it. After this man posted the footage online, it went viral, and before long, major news outlets all over the world were reaching out to Ephraim and the other volunteers for interviews. This was the story that me and my teammates in Virginia in that office saw in 2017, and that image we saw of Ephraim standing behind the tank with the AK-47, that was moments before he rushed out behind the tank and provided cover fire for Dave and the other to run over and grab the girl and the other two men. The gunshot wound that Ephraim sustained in his leg wound up being relatively minor, if you consider gunshot wounds to be minor. It did not hit an artery and it did not shatter his bone. And so after only a few months, he was more or less back to strength, and instead of just taking it easy, he was in another conflict zone in Burma, this time working with a new volunteer organization, one that he founded called Stronghold Rescue and Relief. And their mission is to protect and care for families in conflict zones. Their motto is, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Despite being a very small organization, they are having enormous impacts all over the world, but they need our help. They rely on a small army of people who pitch in small donations every month to keep operations flowing. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, please consider joining their army by supporting them on a monthly basis, just like I am. If you do, you'll not only gain my respect and admiration, you'll also get sent one of these awesome shirts with that amazing quote on the back. The link to join their army is in the description of this video. Also, if you just click on that link, it will bring you to their website and you can see the full unedited footage of their rescue mission. In 1980, Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the area, he didn't know anybody that was going to this particular school, and so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he wasn't that popular in high school, and he had a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars and carrying boxes up to their dorm rooms. And so he took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. And a couple people yelled out to him and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." And one girl actually ran up to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." And Bobby said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." And she laughed and she just ran away. And so Bobby's totally bewildered by this because he doesn't know anybody, but everybody seems to know him. And so he walks up the steps and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. And then right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" And Bobby knew whoever it was yelling at him. Because this whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling out, "Hey, Eddie, come here, what's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not, but I'm not Eddie. Who's Eddie?" And the guy said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie, it's good to have you back here, man," and then walked off. And so Bobby's like, what is going on here? And so Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room and he goes inside and he just shuts the door and he's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second because this is not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. And just a couple of minutes after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door and Bobby's like, oh great, who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not? So he opens the door and there's another student who he doesn't know who's standing there, and this guy, his face just drains of color and he starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, were you adopted? And Bobby said, yeah. And then the student said, is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, yeah. And so the student goes, okay, my name is Michael and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin. At this point, to Bobby, this almost made sense, but it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin he didn't know about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie, because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone you talked to was so excited to see you, because they love Eddie, and they thought you were him, and so they're psyched to have you back. After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie, and they have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie and vice versa. And so Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth. They hop inside, they're crammed in there, and they dial up Eddie. And as soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, hey Eddie, my name's Bobby, and everybody thinks I'm you. And then Eddie says, yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too. And Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, he said it sounded like his own voice coming through the phone. And so ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that Eddie and Bobby could see if it really was true that they were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped in Bobby's car and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. And when they got there, it was the middle of the night, and Eddie's house is the only house in this quiet suburb that has all the lights on. And so Michael and Bobby walk up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house, and right as Bobby is about to knock on the door, it flies open, and standing in front of Bobby is his exact clone. It's Eddie. And Eddie's looking back at Bobby and he can't believe what he's looking at. They are definitely identical twins, and they both immediately saw that. Michael would say after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection immediately. They knew they were related, and they were laughing and they hugged and they just stared at each other. And Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after, this story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York, and they decided they would look into it to see if it was really true or not. And so one of the editors had a junior reporter fly out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and see if it was really true that they were in fact identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kelman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins because these two twins look exactly like David. Specifically, they said you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie, and sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his. And they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number, and Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, hi, my name is David Kelman. I was born July 12th, 1961. And I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me. And one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin. After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, they're coming out of the woodwork. So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house, and as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away he was one of them. He was the third twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like, even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen, that it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected after all these years. Shortly after David realized realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story talking about how there was actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected. And once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story. And now this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper, they were on every talk show, and everybody had the same question. What similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school. We all smoked the same cigarettes. We like the same food. We had the same taste in women. And on talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the same mannerisms. And on the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight, and all 3 of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together. They went out partying. They met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't asking questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had 2 identical siblings. They had no idea. So the boy's adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York. Very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York use this adoption agency if they're going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids have been separated. And so the parents go to New York, they go into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they say, did you separate our sons at birth on purpose? And one of the executives said, yes, we did, because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point, David's adoptive father lashed out and said, that's absolute BS. If you had told me he had 2 identical siblings, I would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened, and so sorry, that's all we can tell you. And so the parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story, and in fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency. And right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't want to disturb anyone, and he opened the door to the meeting room and he reached in to get his umbrella, and he looked inside and he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne, and they were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they clearly had just lied to the families of these 3 triplets and they'd gotten away with it. And so between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something and then Bobby discovering this champagne toast as soon as they left, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. And the parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this, that clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn to try to get more information. And so over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. And so over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. And at some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. And the first year, it was extremely successful, did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together. They had never really fought. And so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business. And it got really bad really quick, and they just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the 3 brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together. And now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks. And then shortly after getting out of the hospital, until he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the two brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied, although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research. In this article, Lawrence discovered all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency, the same one the triplets had come from, the Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health, and that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered, and after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered themselves. These two women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Robbie did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, actually this was part of a study, but they didn't give any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was this doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was this very well-known psychologist in New York. And so Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, I won't answer any of your questions and I won't give you any information about this study. And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives so no one could access it until 2066, which has led many people to believe that the reason he set it so far out was to guarantee all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved in this study. In the recent documentary called 3 Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowicz, she was interviewed and they asked her, can you shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were? And she would say that she was not actually part of the study. She was more on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. And she said the point of the study was to finally put to bed whether it was nature or nurture that made the person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that ultimately makes you who you become, or is it just your genetic makeup, that you're predestined to become a particular person independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible, that basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup, that we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically, in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer, and so they were very well educated, and that was his upbringing. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they just had this very small shop that they owned. And Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also, in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would actually make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up under the false pretext that they were there as part of routine follow-up for the adoption agency. And he went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class, it was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child. And that first child they adopted effectively became the guinea pig for this study, where scientists would come in and they would study this child under the false pretext that they were there just following up for the adoption agency, but really they were creating a baseline of how do these parents parent. And then once that baseline was established, then the triplets were sent into their respective homes, with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up, with the adoptive father being the X factor. Bobby's father, who was a doctor, was rarely around, but he was devoted and loving to his son. David's father, who was the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son and loved him unconditionally. Eddie's father was a teacher who was around a fair amount, but when he was very strict and rough with Eddie and quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection for him. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed and ultimately taking his life, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was. That David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study that we're all genetically predisposed to become a particular person. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third hand information. But what we do know for sure is these surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary 3 Identical Strangers, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. And when they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results, but it turned out it was over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place, or what it accomplished. It was just all very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved in the study, none of them were held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study. And so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers. On the morning of February 2nd, 2012, a young man pulled off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, into a large, snowy parking lot. He passed by dozens of parked cars until he arrived in front of this small shack that was brightly teal colored. It was a popular coffee shop called the Common Grounds, and this young man worked as a barista there. After he parked his car, he walked up to the white door employee entrance to this little building, and he got his key out and he went to unlock the door, but when he turned the key, he saw the door was already unlocked. He knew the girl who had worked the previous night and would have been responsible for locking the shop up. She was 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, and although she had only been on the job for about a month, she seemed very responsible and had never had any issues closing up before. The young man shrugged it off though. He figured people make mistakes, and he went inside. Right away, he noticed that a couple of things just seemed out of place. It was like Samantha must have just left in the middle of her shift without even attempting to clean up. There were napkins on the ground, there were towels out, there were cups still out. And so as this young man is walking over to the cash register to unlock it, he's running through scenarios in his head about how Samantha could have been so sloppy. And then he reached down with his register key, and just like the door, the cash register was already unlocked. When he pulled the tray out, all the money was gone. And that's when he knew they had been robbed. And so he called his boss. The night before, Samantha had asked her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift at the common grounds. Dwayne arrived in front of the kiosk at about 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift should have been over. Dwayne had gotten held up at his job, which is why he was late. And so when he gets there, Dwayne looks around the parking lot and he doesn't see Samantha anywhere. He sees the coffee shop itself is totally dark and looks like it's been closed up for the night. And so Dwayne gets out of his truck into the freezing cold night air, and he walked up to the window of this coffee shop and he pressed his face up to the glass to look inside, but there was nobody in there. Dwayne automatically went back to the fight he had gotten into with Samantha earlier in the night via text message. She had accused him of cheating on her. He had been kind of nonchalant, like he didn't care about it, and what ensued was a really ugly fight. And so as Dwayne is walking back to his truck, he's thinking to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight, and so at the end of her shift, she got a ride home from her father, or maybe from a friend, and that's why she's not here. And so Dwayne gets back inside of his truck, and he sends a text message to Samantha asking if she's okay, if she's gotten home, but after several minutes of no response from her, Dwayne, even though they were fighting, he still cares an awful lot about his girlfriend. He decides, I gotta go by her house and make sure she's there and that she's okay. And so a couple minutes later, he gets to her house, he goes up to the door, and her single father, James, answers the door. Dwayne explains that he didn't see Samantha after her shift and just wanted to make sure she was here, but James says, she's not here. I have no idea where she is. I haven't spoken to her. And so the two men go into James's kitchen, they sit down, and they start texting and calling Samantha to try to figure out where she is. And after a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lights up, and it's a text message from Samantha. And the message clearly indicates that she's still very upset with Dwayne, but she's saying that she needs some time to think, and that she's going to be with some friends for a couple of days, and would he, Dwayne, let her father know where she was. And so Dwayne shows James the text message, and Samantha's father looks at it, and he's thinking to himself, this is very uncharacteristic of Samantha. He had raised Samantha since she was 2 years old, and they were very close. They shared everything with each other. It didn't make any sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say that she was going to be out with friends for a couple of days. And it didn't make sense that she would ignore all of his phone calls and text messages when clearly he was worried about her. The two men stayed up super late, calling and texting, hoping to get more information from Samantha, but she never responded. She never texted back. And so the following morning, when neither man had gotten any more messages from Samantha, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report for his only daughter. After receiving this missing person report, an officer with the Anchorage Police Department called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. And the owner actually said they just got a call from their barista that was working at the kiosk that morning, and they had informed them that apparently there had been a robbery and no one can get in touch with Samantha. No one knows where she is. The owner told the police officer that as soon as she got her hands on the security footage from the night before, she would send it over to the police department. While the police waited for this footage, some officers began calling Samantha's friends and other family members to see if they knew where she was, but no one had heard from her and no one knew where she was. No one had any information. Some other police officers headed over to the Common Grounds coffee kiosk to get a look at it for themselves. And when they got there, there was no sign of a struggle outside or inside the kiosk, and inside, underneath the counter, was a panic button that had not been pressed. And so even though Samantha's father thought there was something odd about her final text message, the police began operating under the theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk and then left of her own accord. But what confounded police was how Samantha actually physically got away from the coffee shop. She didn't have a car that night, and she couldn't have just walked away because the weather was way too miserable and cold outside, and Anchorage is just not really a walkable city. And so if Samantha was telling the truth, that she was just taking a couple of days to be by herself with some friends at their place, then why didn't any of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop made the security footage available. The footage, which has no audio, picks up around 8 p.m. on February 1st, 2012, which was the night Samantha went missing. It shows Samantha inside of the kiosk. She's working alone, she's cheerful, and she's busy. And then at some point, someone that we can't see, they're outside of the camera's range, comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha clearly turns to them, acknowledges their drink order, and turns and begins making this drink. And then after she's done making it, she turns to give it to this person, and immediately Samantha steps back and puts her arms up. And then seconds later, she reaches over and turns off the lights inside of the kiosk, and then she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, not talking, not moving, for about a minute before she slowly stands up and walks down the kiosk towards the cash register. She opens it up, she scoops some money out of it, and then she walks back to the window and appears to hand it to a shadowy figure on the other side of the window, and then Samantha turns, kneels again with her back to the window. 2 more minutes go by before this person outside the window leans their entire upper body inside of the coffee shop. They reach down and they appear to tie Samantha's hands. Now, because it was dark inside of the kiosk, the footage winds up being extremely grainy, and there's no way to identify who this figure is. Although it's fairly obvious that it's a male. He's wearing a big sweatshirt and he's got a hat pulled down low over his face. After this mystery man is done tying Samantha's hands, he leaps through the window and then shuts the window behind him. And then he stands Samantha up, he puts a gun into her back, and then he marches her out the employee door and then out across the lot, all the way to a white pickup truck where he puts her inside and they drive off. Over the next couple of days, the police and also the FBI, who had been called in to be a part of this investigation, they just kept hitting dead end after dead end because there was no evidence. All they had was this surveillance footage that was too grainy to tell who this guy was that took Samantha. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, had rallied the support of nearly all 300,000 people that lived in Anchorage to go out and look for his daughter. His efforts were so profound, it had attracted major news outlets across the country, and suddenly his daughter's story had grabbed national headlines everywhere. This led to strangers donating thousands of dollars to fund a reward for anybody that had information about Samantha's whereabouts. But despite this reward growing in size every single day, and the national news media becoming increasingly more interested in this case, no one came forward with useful information that led to developments in this case, and Samantha never got in touch with Dwayne or her father. Then on February 24th, so 3 weeks after Samantha's gone missing and no one's heard from her, Dwayne got a text message from Samantha's phone, and it was directing him to a particular sign inside of a nearby public park. And so Dwayne and James read this text, they shared it with the police department, and then they raced to this park and actually beat the police there by about 15 minutes. And so Dwayne and James, they walk through the gates and they start walking down this main trail, and they stop in front of this sign. It was actually a bulletin board, and tacked on the bulletin board was a Ziploc bag, inside of which was a typed ransom note, and on the ransom note, literally Xeroxed onto it, was a black and white photo of Samantha. And in this photo, Samantha looks kind of dazed, like she's got a blank expression, and she's not really looking at the camera, she's looking just to the side of the camera. And then in this picture, a man is holding a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper that's dated February 13th, 2012. This was a proof of life photo where Samantha's captor was holding up that newspaper to indicate that Samantha was alive as of February 13th. And so to everybody involved in this case, including Samantha's father, even though this is still not a good situation at all, it was kind of a relief to know that at least as of last week, Samantha was alive. As for the demands of this ransom note, James was told to deposit $30,000 into his daughter's account immediately, and if he did that, she would be released 6 months later. As advised by the FBI, James deposited a portion of the ransom money into his daughter's account, and then the FBI just waited and watched, because they knew if anyone tried to withdraw money from that account, they could track where the card was. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made within Anchorage, but each time the FBI got a notification about one of these withdrawals, they would rush to the scene, and whoever it was that had tried to make this withdrawal was long gone. When they pulled the security footage from these 3 different ATMs, the person that was making these withdrawals was a man wearing a ski mask and big sunglasses, so they had no way to identify him. After these withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week, and in that time, there was no word from Samantha. Then on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but they were in Arizona, and then New Mexico, and then in Texas. Again, authorities would rush to these ATMs, but they would get there right after the masked man with sunglasses had just left. But there was a break this time. In one of of these surveillance videos from one of the Texas ATMs, they spotted the car this guy was getting into before he left. And it was a small sedan, it was a white Ford Focus, and they saw him leave going east on a Texas highway. And so authorities in Texas were told to look out for this particular car in this part of Texas. And sure enough, on March 13th, a Texas patrolman spotted the car sitting in a hotel parking lot. He waited nearby until a man in his 30s walked out of one of the hotel rooms, walked down and got inside the car, and then this patrolman just kind of followed him and looked for any reason to pull him over. And as he had his radar gun on this guy, he noticed he was going 2 miles per hour above the speed limit, and so he pulled him over. The patrolman got out, he walked up to the driver's side window, the window was already down, the man was very calm. The patrolman asked him for his license, and the guy handed him an Alaskan license. His name was Israel Keys, he was 34 years old, and he lived in Anchorage. The patrolman knew this was the guy. He called in backup, and before long they were searching Keys' car, and in the trunk they found a ski mask along with other clothes that matched the description of the guy who was making withdrawals from these different ATMs. They also found a gun, as well as Samantha's cell phone and debit card. After Keys was arrested and was brought into custody, he denied having any involvement with Samantha's disappearance. But after being presented with the overwhelming evidence that suggested otherwise, he caved and said yes, he would tell them the full story of what happened to Samantha, but they had to get him an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers, and a cigar. Once he had said items, he began to speak. And what he said was so disturbing and so graphic, the FBI still has not released the full transcript of his confession. Here is the version of events based on what was made public. On February 1st, 2012, Keys decided he was going to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting there to be some teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He asked her for an Americano, and while she turned to make his drink, suddenly his plan changed. Not only was he going to steal money from inside of this coffee shop, he decided he was going to steal Samantha from this coffee shop. When she turned back with his drink and handed it to him, he discreetly pulled his gun out and aimed it at her and told her this was a robbery. That's when she backed up and put her hands up, and then she turned around, he tied her hands, he jumped back inside, and then he said after he shut the window, he jammed napkins inside of her mouth so she couldn't make any sound, and then he marched her out the door, outside, into his car, and they took off. Once they were in the vehicle, he pulled the napkins out of her mouth, and he told her if she tried to escape or if she tried to flag anybody down, that he would just kill her. And so he said she was very obedient. She was obviously very scared, but she was trying to do her best to stay composed. At some point, Keys reached over and took her phone and sent that text message to her boyfriend, informing him that she was going to be spending a couple of days with friends and that he should tell her father. And then Keys told Samantha he was going to be holding her hostage and trying to extract some ransom money. Samantha told Keys that her family was very poor and that he wouldn't get much money out of them. To which Keys said, "Don't worry about it. I know they'll raise money and they'll come up with it somehow." Then they drove around Anchorage for several hours, periodically stopping so Samantha could get out and relieve herself, other times so Keys could smoke a cigar. Then around midnight, Keys made his way back to his house and he pulled into the driveway and he turned to Samantha and he had her go in the back seat and lie down, and he put some tarps over her and he told her if she tried to escape, he would kill her. And then Keys got out and he walked inside of his house where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. And in just a few hours, Keys and his daughter were scheduled to go to New Orleans for a 2-week-long luxury cruise. Keys left his house and went back to his car. He put a blindfold on Samantha and then led her down the driveway to his shed. Once inside, he sat her down on an upturned bucket in the back of the shed, and then he put a rope around her neck and he anchored each end of the rope to the wall so she was pinned to the wall. Then Keys turned his radio all the way up to make sure it masked any noise she might make, even though he reminded her repeatedly that if she made any noise, he would just kill her, and by and large, she was very obedient. And then he gave her a couple of cigarettes to smoke and told her it was going to be just fine, to just chill out, that he was going to get the ransom money from their family, and then as soon as that was done, he would let her go. He turned on some space heaters to keep the space warm, and then he left and locked the door. He walked back into his house and double-checked that his daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. They were. Afterwards, he started drinking some wine and relaxing, and then after a little while, he got a cup of water and he went back out to the shed. He went inside and he gave the water to Samantha, and he said Samantha was very composed. She was obviously frightened, but she asked him, "Did you speak to my father? Did you figure out the ransom situation?" And Keys told her that, "Yes, I talked to your father. Everything's working out fine. He's going to raise raise the money. We're going to get you out of here. Everything's going exactly to plan. After that, he walked up to Samantha and he unscrewed the 2 anchors that were holding that rope up against her throat. And then he cut the zip ties on her wrist, allowing her to relax and sit forward and just kind of be at ease for a second. And it was very obvious that Samantha was relieved. Her nightmare was about to be over. But then seconds later, Keyes grabbed her really aggressively and tied her up all over again, this time much more thoroughly and much more tightly. It had been a cruel trick. When he cut her handcuffs and undid her necktie, he just wanted to see what she would do if she thought she was being let go. When in reality, he was never going to let her go. There was no ransom. He had not spoken to her father. It was all a big lie. Keyes told investigators that as he was tying her up for that second time, he looked at her face and she had this look of total resignation. He said she knew what was about to happen to her. After Keyes tied her up, he left the shed and locked it behind him. He went inside to check one more time to make sure his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. When they were, he went back to the shed, he opened it up, he went inside, and this time when he stepped inside, it smelled like urine and sweat, and he looked down at Samantha and she was terrified. He walked up to her and he began to assault her. And then after he was done, he was standing over her, getting his clothes back on, and Samantha very stoically looks up at him and says, "Are you going to kill me?" And he says, "Yes, I am." As he put on his leather gloves, she tried to talk him out of it, but he said there was no other way. Keyes would tell investigators that he was very impressed with Samantha's bravery. Shortly before 4 a.m., Keyes drove a knife into Samantha's back before choking her until she stopped moving. He told investigators that she never made a sound. After she was dead, Keyes left the shed and locked it behind him. He went into his house, he took a shower. Afterwards, he woke up his daughter and told her to start getting ready because they were leaving soon for the airport. While his daughter was getting ready, Keyes went back out to the shed. He went inside. He rolled Samantha's body up in a tarp and pushed her towards the back. He unplugged the space heaters, turned off the lights, turned off the music, and then double locked the shed and went back inside the house to make his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., a cab showed up at the house, and Keyes and his daughter hopped inside, and they made their way to the airport and then on to New Orleans, where they went on their 2-week-long vacation. After they got back, Keyes went inside of his shed. He unrolled Samantha from her tarp, and by his account, she still looked fairly lively. And so he dressed her in some new clothes. He put lots of makeup on her face. He braided her hair, and then he stitched her eyelids open so it gave the impression she was alive and alert. And then he held up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News next to her, and then took several photos, creating that proof of life photo for the ransom note. If you want to see this photo, you can Google it, but that's up to you. After he took these pictures, he chopped her body up into pieces and then disposed of her in a nearby frozen lake. It would turn out Samantha was not Israel Keyes' first victim. He was in fact a serial killer who specifically preyed on completely random people because he enjoyed watching them die. Over the years, he had hid what he called kill kits all over the United States, which were these caches filled with weapons and other tools designed to capture and kill people. This way, no matter where he was in the country, when he had an urge to go kill someone, he would just go to his nearest kill kit, dig it up, and then go target a random stranger. And he didn't care if you were young, old, big, small, male, female, alone, or in a group. Everyone was a target of opportunity. Keyes told investigators that as soon as he saw Samantha inside of that coffee kiosk, instantly he knew he was going to kill her. Everything about the ransom, the robbery, all of it was just a lie to keep her in line, to give her some hope that she might get out of this alive. When in reality, the second she walked outside of the doors of that kiosk, she was dead. Keyes admitted to killing Samantha as well as an older couple up in Vermont, but he would take his own life in a jail cell in December of 2012 before he named any of his other victims. And so to this day, we have no idea how many people he killed. The best guess is 11 based on a drawing he made in his jail cell, but that's On the morning of February 4th, 1991, a taxicab driver named Wang was chatting with the taxi dispatcher at headquarters when suddenly, for no clear reason, the dispatcher stopped talking to Wang and just began staring intently at something behind Wang. And so Wang noticed this, and right away he turned around to see what it was he was looking at. But all Wang could see was just a window that looked out to this huge fenced-in parking lot that was full of taxi cabs and their drivers. This is where they would go to wait for fares. And where the taxi headquarters were located was right near the airport in a very busy city called Kaohsiung City in Taiwan. And so taxi cabs in this area were really in high demand. And so as Wang looked out at the very busy parking lot full of drivers talking to potential customers, To Wang, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just a typical busy day. But when Wang kind of looked at the dispatcher like, I don't really see what you see, the dispatcher just raised his finger and kind of pointed in the direction that he was staring. And so Wang turned around again, and this time, when he looked in the direction the dispatcher was pointing, he could see immediately why the dispatcher was reacting the way he was. Because the dispatcher was pointing at one of their colleagues, so another taxi driver, whose name was Leo Shui Chung, and as Wang looked out at him, he saw Leo was sprinting across this very busy parking lot full of all these cabs and drivers and customers, and Leo was clutching this big golden statue of Buddha in his arms as he ran. And so Wang and the dispatcher watched Leo, and what he did is he kept running all the way across the lot until he got to his taxi cab, at which point he practically dove inside of it. He slammed the door, locked every door, and then began looking around frantically like he was expecting someone to show up who had been like chasing him or something. But there was nobody around his car, and Wang and the dispatcher kind of scanned the parking lot, and they didn't see anybody who seemed remotely interested in Leo. And so Wang and the dispatcher continued to watch Leo from the window, and they saw eventually Leo stopped kind of scanning around for other people. And at that point, he took that golden statue of Buddha and he placed it up on the dash of his cab. And this was not the first Buddha statue that he had put up there. From Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it looked like he had at least 2 or 3 that were right up there alongside this new one. And then after Leo placed this new golden statue, he sort of sat back in his chair, and from Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it sort of looked like he had closed his eyes and was praying or mumbling something, but whatever he was doing, it just seemed kind of odd. And so eventually, Wang and the dispatcher stopped watching Leo, who still just continued to sit back in his chair and, mumble or pray or something. And then Wang and the dispatcher looked at each other and they exchanged very concerned looks. Because they both knew, Leo was kind of a weird guy, but from his behavior today, it just seemed like, something must be wrong with Leo. There has to be some issue. So for context, Leo was this 35-year-old guy who lived alone, and he had this reputation of being very antisocial and kind of just rude. Like he had terrible manners. But recently, Wang and the dispatcher and other taxi drivers who worked at this company had noticed that Leo's behavior had gone from being kind of awkward and antisocial to being kind of menacing, like not even including the weird behavior he was exhibiting now, just like in his day-to-day interactions with people, he was just really aggressive. Like, he always would tell his colleagues at the taxi company how much he hated stray cats and dogs. And, a lot of people found these stray cats and dogs in their neighborhood in the city to be a bit of a nuisance. They'd rummage through trash and make noise or whatever, but nobody really paid them much attention. They were just stray animals trying to survive. Like, it wasn't a big deal. But for Leo, he obsessed over hating the stray cats and dogs and how much he wanted them to get out of his neighborhood. And somewhat recently, he had come to work and told his colleagues that he had gone out and gotten a crossbow, and at night he'd begun shooting at the stray cats and dogs, which totally horrified his colleagues. And now Leo had this weird thing going on with his Buddha statues that he was putting inside of his cab. And also, in addition to those statues, he had begun putting on the windows inside of his cab these things called fulus, which are these little strips of yellow parchment paper that basically ward off evil spirits. And so Leo had basically transformed the interior of his cab into this sort of weird shrine or temple. And in fact, Leo had put up so many of these fulus on the inside of the windows, and again, all those statues that sat on the dash, that when he drove, he could barely see because his view was totally obstructed. But despite everybody at the company seeing this totally weird behavior playing out with Leo, nobody went up to him and said, hey, what are you doing with these statues and pieces of paper? What's going on here? Because nobody wanted to interact with him. He seemed like kind of a menace, and so people just kind of let him do his thing. But now, as Wang and the dispatcher are watching Leo run across the lot and act totally psychotic, they looked at each other and they were like, maybe we should do something. And so Wang volunteered to call the police, and as Wang turned to go walk out and make the call, he saw Leo peeling out of the parking lot, nearly smashing into cars and people, just driving like a total maniac. And so Leo really felt like, okay, yeah, this really is the time to step in. Someone's going to get hurt here. The following day, Wang would contact his friend in the police department, and he would explain what was going on with Leo. And to Wang's surprise, his friend told him that actually the police were well aware of Leo. And that was because not all that long ago, Leo was actually a suspect in a murder case. So about 10 months earlier, in April of 1990, a 23-year-old woman from Japan named Mariko Iguchi had visited Taiwan on vacation, and during this vacation, she had gone missing. Now, at the time, the Taiwanese economy really relied heavily on Japanese tourism, and so Taiwan really aggressively marketed to Japan to, come visit, come on vacation here. And so it was pretty common for Japanese college students to visit Taiwan on vacation to celebrate things like a graduation or a birthday party. And so that's what Mariko was doing. She was here celebrating, and she was traveling alone. Also, one sort of quirky thing about Taiwanese culture at the time was it was pretty common for taxi cab drivers to open up their own personal homes to their fares, basically saying, hey, don't stay at a hotel. I'll give you a ride wherever you're going to go, but then at night you can stay at my house with my family. And so it was just kind of a thing in Taiwan that people visited and stayed at the homes of their taxi cab drivers. So when Mariko came to Taiwan on this vacation, this is what she did. She stayed in the home of the taxi cab driver, and it was during this period of time that she went missing. And so naturally, when the investigation began into her disappearance, the first place police went were the taxi cab drivers. And so first, the police focused on a driver in the capital of Taiwan who said he had given Mariko a few rides, he had brought her sightseeing, and then he had let her stay in his home. But he said, after that, she left and he didn't see her again. He had no idea what happened to her. And the police would actually discover that after Mariko left that particular driver's house, she would send a postcard to her family that was dated after she had left. And so basically this ruled out the first driver as a suspect. And so for a little while, this case went cold because the police couldn't find any other taxi cab drivers that had given Mariko a ride. But then, a few months later, the police offered a reward for information about what happened to Mariko, and it was then that police got a tip that Mariko had been seen speaking to Leo at the train station before she disappeared. But when police spoke to Leo, he immediately said, yes, I did give Mariko a ride, but that was it. She didn't stay at my house. It was just this one ride from the train station into town, and after she got out, I have no idea what happened to her. And so police would ask Leo dozens more questions and they would try to get more information from him, but he just didn't have any. And then at the same time, there was this flood of all these new tips that began coming into the police station about this case. But it would turn out a lot of these leads, like all of them, were just terrible tips. People were calling in totally random stuff just because now there was this monetary reward for information, and it was kind of incentivizing people to just call in anything, and it was actually making the investigation much harder because now the police had all these bad tips, and so they really weren't getting anywhere. But despite the slow progress the police were making in this case had really been elevated and become like a huge international news story, and lots of people all over the world were following it. And during this time, when all these people are tuned in to this case, really weird things began happening surrounding this case. People in the city began receiving all these strange phone calls from this kind of frantic woman speaking Japanese. And in Taiwan, people predominantly speak Taiwanese and Mandarin, not Japanese. So this is a weird phone call to be getting in Taiwan. And also at this time, you need to remember that Mariko's disappearance was kind of all over the news. And so to get these weird calls from a woman speaking Japanese who sounds totally frantic, it made people in the city believe that it was Mariko placing these strange phone calls. But these calls, they didn't make any sense. It was just a woman kind of yelling in Japanese, and then she would just abruptly hang up. And also there were all these reports of people claiming to have seen Mariko or heard Mariko just in the city walking around. None of it was substantiated, but there was just kind of this eerie quality to the case. And so when Wang called his friend at the police department to report Leo for his totally weird behavior, this was at a time when the Mariko missing person case was still totally front of mind in Taiwan and around the world, and also the police were still actively investigating this case, and frankly, Leo had not been ruled out as a suspect in this case. He was not considered a primary suspect by any means, but he wasn't ruled out yet, and so the police are hearing that Leo's acting really funny, and it made them think, hey, maybe we should reinvestigate this guy and see if he really is connected to the Mariko missing person case. And so ultimately, after Wang hung up, his friend in the police department got in touch with the lead detective on the Mariko case and told him about what was going on with Leo. And this lead detective, whose name was Lin Xiaoji, decided he would just put Leo under surveillance to see what he was doing. So, starting sometime in the middle of February of 1991, Detective Lin and a few of his colleagues began taking turns trailing Leo basically 24/7. And so the police just kept their distance and they followed Leo all around the city as he picked up his fares. And, the police never got out to talk to any of the fares, to get insights into whatever Leo might have been saying inside the cab. They just kind of watched from a distance and just wanted to see if there was any obvious red flags. Detective Lin figured, if Leo was somehow involved in whatever happened to Mariko, let's say she was killed, and let's say Leo was responsible for killing her, maybe if they followed Leo long enough, he might drive to an area that was kind of connected to her murder, maybe her gravesite or the place where he killed her or something. Going to kind of strange random locations without a fare would likely be an indication to police that that was a place of interest. But as the police tailed Leo, that's not what he did. Leo basically never ever left his cab. Leo basically just picked up a passenger, drove them where they needed to go, and then repeated over and over and over again all day long. And then at the end of the night, instead of going home to his apartment that police knew he had, he would just sleep inside of his cab, just like in parking lots and stuff. And the only times he would go into his apartment appeared to be just so he could go to the bathroom or maybe shower or something, because they would see him through the window. But whenever Leo went into his apartment, he went through the same totally weird ritual every time. He would be in his cab, parked out front of his apartment, and the police are, parked far enough away that they can watch this. And Leo, at some point, would begin kind of frantically looking all around him, as if he was looking for somebody who was trying to hurt him or who was spying on him or something. And then after kind of making sure the coast was clear, Leo would open up his door and sprint, like absolutely as fast as he could, into his apartment building, and he'd only be in there for like a couple of minutes before he'd come bombing back out and practically dive into his cab, and he would shut all the doors, lock all the doors, and then, he'd clutch his golden statues and he'd rub his fulus that were taped all over the inside of his cab, and he'd continue frantically looking around, to make sure nobody was there to hurt him or something. And then after a little while, he'd kind of calm down, he'd put his statue back on the dash, he'd kind of make sure his fulus were all in place, and then he would drive away. So, of course, Leo's behavior, from the police's perspective, was totally bizarre, but in Detective Lin's mind, it didn't really seem like the behavior of a murderer. It seemed more like the behavior of someone who had lost their mind. Finally, on March 4th, 1991, Detective Lin decided that he just needed to speak to Leo, which required, basically ambushing Leo. So Detective Lin coordinated with his officers who were out surveilling Leo, and he had them tell him when Leo was at his apartment, going in to use the bathroom. And when they called in to Detective Lin that, hey, he just got to his apartment, he's about to run inside, Detective Lin and some other officers raced to the apartment, and they were all ready outside for whenever Leo came running back out to dive back into his cab. They were going to intercept him. And now Detective Lin and his colleagues didn't really know how Leo was going to react to having all these police standing there ready to grab him. I mean, was this guy going to be hostile? Was he going to be aggressive? Was he going to be scared, sad? They had no idea. It just seemed like Leo was totally unstable, so they all kind of had to be ready for whatever reaction he was going to have. However, the way Leo ultimately reacted to this was not the way any of the officers suspected. When Leo came bombing out of his apartment after a very short bathroom break, he began charging down the stairs towards his cab, and then seemed to kind of realize there were all these detectives and police officers all standing in front of him, literally getting ready to grab him, and Leo just collapsed to his knees and began sobbing and thanking them over and over and over again. Now, Detective Lin had no idea what this was. He didn't really understand what Leo was thanking them for, but he didn't waste any time trying to figure out what was going on. Instead, Detective Lin just went up to Leo and said, hey, we need to speak to you at the station. Will you come with us? And Leo was like, of course I will. Of course I will. And so Detective Lin drove Leo to the police station, and when they got there, Leo was saying things like, oh, I wish I could just stay at the police station with you all. Like, this is where I'm safe. I want to stay here. Now, Lin didn't really respond to this. He just kind of said, okay, yeah. And then they went inside together to head towards the interview room, and as they're walking there, Leo was saying over and over again to Detective Lin and any of the officers he passes by, thank you so much, you're my savior, thank you. Now, the police had no idea why Leo was treating them like his saviors. because to them, they're like, dude, we just ambushed you and brought you to the police station to question you about potentially being involved in a murder, so I don't know how we saved you. But it would turn out Liao had a really compelling reason to believe they really had just saved him, because it would turn out Liao had this absolutely terrifying thing happening inside of his apartment. Just several minutes earlier, when Liao had run into his apartment, so right before he charged back outside and police grabbed him and took him to the station, when he was still inside of his apartment, he stepped inside and the apartment was totally dark. All the lights are off, all the shades are drawn, and immediately Liao felt his heart starting to race. And he looked around his apartment and it was totally silent, but then he heard it. He could hear on the far side of his apartment, in a room that he couldn't quite see into, the sound of breathing. But Liao lives alone. There shouldn't be anybody here. He has no pets, there's nobody here, but he hears breathing in another room. But Liao knew there was nothing he could do. The only thing he could do was just try to get in there, go to the bathroom, and get out as quickly as possible. And so very slowly, Liao began kind of tiptoeing across the living room floor, kind of making sure to stay out of eyesight of the doorway that led into the room where the breathing was coming from. And as soon as he kind of got past an area where he could be seen from the doorway, he ran the rest of the way down the hallway. He cut into the bathroom and shut the door and locked it. And then as quickly as he could, he did his business. He used a washcloth to clean himself because he didn't have time to take a shower because of what was going on inside of his apartment. And then once he was all done, he took a deep breath and then he opened up the door. And this time, the apartment was absolutely silent. There was no more breathing. And so Liao, thinking he had this opportunity to get out of here without being caught by this thing inside of his apartment, he turned and just started running towards the door. And as soon as he did, he began to hear a voice, a hoarse female voice, screaming at him from the other side of his apartment, screeching, "Why? Why? Why?" And as Liao is just about to get to the door, he turns and he sees Mariko, the missing woman, running with her hair all knotted and matted, hanging over her face, sprinting towards him from that back room. And Liao, he only managed to barely get out of his apartment and shut it and lock it before she ran into the door. And then it went silent again. This is why Liao was acting totally crazy, because he was terrified of what he believed was like this demonic entity inside of his apartment. He didn't think that was a real person. He thought it was like the spirit of Mariko or something, and she was haunting him. And so he had no idea what to do. He didn't know who to tell, and he just began living out of his cab instead of dealing with whatever was going on in his apartment. And so when Liao charged outside after this latest encounter with Mariko, he sees the police, and Liao is just overwhelmed with relief. Hopefully, he's thinking, they can get rid of her and his life can go back to normal. But as overjoyed as Liao appeared to be, and now having the police on his side, finally being able to deal with whatever was going on, when push came to shove, Liao actually did not feel comfortable immediately giving up details of whatever was going on with Mariko inside of his apartment. But as Liao was brought by Detective Lin to the police station to tell them what was going on with how Mariko was in his apartment and she was haunting him, it seemed like it was the ghost of her or something. As Liao was having that conversation, other police officers were sent to Liao's apartment to go see if maybe Mariko really was in his apartment. Maybe that's where she had been this whole time. Maybe she broke into this guy's apartment and was just squatting there and harassing him, and that was the mystery. That's where she's been. But when police went into Liao's apartment, there was no sign whatsoever that anybody else besides Liao was living in that apartment. There was no sign of a break-in. There was nothing. It was just Liao's apartment. And so this made police really suspicious of Liao because his story was so outrageous, and also he's talking about a person who's actively missing, Mariko. And so the police really pressured Liao to, come forward, give us more information. Why did you say this is Mariko in your apartment? Because there's nobody in your apartment. Tell us what's going on here. And so finally, after 4 days of intense questioning of Liao did finally admit to police that there was more to this story. It would turn out Liao really did pick Mariko up at the train station when she arrived in Taiwan for her vacation. So he did give her a ride, just like he said he had. But Liao had lied about what happened after that. It would turn out, after giving her this ride, Leao stayed with Mariko and they went sightseeing together, and then Leao invited Mariko to stay with him at his apartment, which again was customary in Taiwan. And so Mariko said yes, and she went to his apartment in the evening, and while they were there, Leao did proposition Mariko, and she rejected him. And at first, Leao just let it go, but then after Mariko fell asleep that night, he got his crossbow that he used to shoot dogs and cats, and he went into her room and he shot her 4 times with the crossbow and then cut her head off. Leao would bury her body the following night, but that same night was the first time Leao began hearing the breathing in his apartment. He couldn't quite place it, and then not long after that, the head of Mariko, the severed head, would chase him all around his apartment screaming, why at him. And so basically Mariko's severed head began haunting Leao incessantly to the point where he moved into his taxi cab and put up all those fulu papers to protect him from evil spirits, and also put up all those statues of Buddha for the same reason. I mean, he was living in his cab to protect himself from what he believed was this evil spirit. And so when people saw Leao in his cab kind of sitting back and muttering to himself, that was him praying that he would live through whatever was going on with this head. Leao would tell police where he buried Mariko's body, and he would tell police he buried her entire body in one location, including her head. But when police dug her up, it was only her lower half. Her head was missing. Leao was convicted of murder, and to this day, he is still in prison. Many people in Taiwan believe that, this case was ultimately solved because of Mariko's spirit, that she played a big role. Her head haunting Leao is what drove him crazy to the point where he admitted to police what he did. And then also, people in Taiwan think all those strange phone calls they were getting from that woman who was speaking Japanese and acting frantic and then hanging up, they say that was Mariko's spirit too, that was maybe one of her attempts just to keep people engaged with the story so that it wouldn't fade and become a cold case. And in fact, even some of the police, including Detective Lin, say they do believe Mariko's spirit played a role. And in fact, Detective Lin said at one point when he was inside of Leao's apartment, he was by himself and he felt someone push him on the back. And when he turned around, there was nobody there. And so he was convinced that Mariko's spirit was inhabiting that apartment. On the afternoon of May 6th, 2008, a 54-year-old man called Ricky Williams stood on the riverbank casting out his line into the waters of Dismal Creek in Western Virginia. Ricky was hoping to get lucky and catch some trout, but he'd been out here fishing for 30 minutes so far, and there were no bites. Normally, Ricky wouldn't care because he loved just fishing for hours and hours at a time. But today, he and his dog, who was right with him, were really hungry because they'd been out in these woods camping for several weeks now, and their food supply was finally dwindling down to the end. And so if they didn't catch any fish today, they might not eat. Now, for context, where Ricky was fishing, Dismal Creek, despite its bleak name, it was actually a beautiful, secluded spot on top of a mountain that was on the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail is a very famous 2,200-mile-long trail that runs up and down the east coast of the United States. And why that is relevant is because there's this special code for people that hike on the Appalachian Trail. And the code, which all hikers know, is basically if you come across another hiker on the Appalachian Trail, it is your responsibility to help them if they need help. And it is their responsibility to help you if you need help. So it's this community of hikers that are always looking to help each other. And so Ricky was very aware of this code on the Appalachian Trail, and he was secretly hoping, as he cast his line over and over again and didn't get any bites, that a hiker or a group of hikers might come by this area and maybe they would see him and come down and learn that he needed food, and they might just give him some of their food. But another half hour passed and no hikers came by, and still Ricky could not catch any fish. But then suddenly, Ricky's dog, who was right next to him, began to whine and kind of began shifting around like it was sensing a predator in the area or something. But as Ricky was trying to calm his dog down, he began to hear a voice in the woods right behind him. Somebody was moving towards him. And when Ricky heard this voice, on the one hand, he was pretty excited because maybe this is a hiker who can give him some food. But on the other hand, Ricky couldn't help but feel really uneasy Now, you need to understand that Ricky was an older guy, he was kind of frail, and over the past few weeks that he'd been camping with his dog, as his food supply had run down, he had become skinnier and skinnier and skinnier, and so he really did not pose any sort of threat to anybody. He's like this weak older man. Now, generally speaking, the Appalachian Trail was a very safe place, but over the last few decades, there had actually been several murders that took place on the Appalachian Trail. And in fact, one of those killings took place less than 2 miles away from where Ricky was fishing with his dog. And in that double homicide, a very well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had stabbed and shot to death 2 hikers. And so while Ricky was really looking for help from fellow hikers, at the same time, he couldn't help but feel somewhat apprehensive. Because again, Ricky was like this small, frail guy, and Ricky was well aware of these murders, and he was well aware of the fact that he was super close to one of the murder sites. And so Ricky was totally on edge as he's listening to this male voice get closer and closer, and then finally, this man in his early 30s steps out from the tree line, and he looks over and he sees Ricky, and for a second, the 2 men just kind of look at each other, but then this guy just grinned at Ricky and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And immediately Ricky felt relieved because he could tell just from looking at this guy that very likely he was not a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston, and he told Ricky he was actually camping in the area with a friend of his, and they were out here fishing just like Ricky. And Ricky pretty much immediately said, "Oh, great, nice to meet you. Do you have any food for me?" And Scott was like, "Absolutely." And he dug into his bag that he had with him, and he pulled out a couple energy bars and a bag of chips, and he threw them over to Ricky. And he also gave some fresh bait to Ricky so he too could cast out again. And for the next couple of hours, Scott and Ricky just stood on the riverbank and fished together. And after a while, the trout did start biting and they did start catching fish. So the day kind of turned into a great outing for Ricky. And it got even better because as soon as the men were done fishing, Scott asked Ricky if he wanted to join him and his friend back up at the campsite for dinner. And remember, Ricky had no food, so this was an amazing invitation. And he said, "Yes, of course, I'd love to join you." So the 2 men packed up their stuff right as the sun was going down, and then they began walking back into the forest where Scott had emerged from. And as they were walking, Scott's fishing pole got tangled on a low-hanging branch, and he was really struggling to get it out of the tree. And so finally, he just told Ricky to, go on ahead. My campsite's right up there. It's a straight shot. Just go up the hill, and you'll see it. Ricky asked Scott if he was sure, and Scott said, "No, it's totally fine, go ahead." So Ricky said, "Okay," and he walked the rest of the way up the hill, and then when he walked out of the tree line into the clearing where Scott's campsite was, immediately what Ricky noticed was this enormous man who was like twice the size of Scott, and so 4 times the size of Ricky, kind of hunched over the campfire. And this huge man, who presumably was Scott's friend, he heard Ricky walk into the circle, and remember, it's nighttime, and they're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and so this guy, he turns his head around and sees this strange man just standing there, and Scott's nowhere to be found, and so this guy, he grabs a club, like a piece of wood, and he looks at Ricky kind of menacingly, like, "What are you doing here?" And Ricky, who was so caught off guard by just how big this guy was, he put his hands up and he said, "I'm so sorry, Scott sent me up here. I don't know if this is the right site. I'm sorry." But just at that moment, Scott had finished untangling his fishing line, and he came out of the tree line, and he patted Ricky on the back, and he said, "Oh, you've already met my friend Sean." And as soon as he said that, Sean looked like he basically let his guard down. He put the wood down, and he stopped glaring directly at Ricky. But Ricky felt like Sean was not happy that Ricky was in his campsite, even though clearly Scott is the reason that Ricky is in this campsite. And so Ricky just felt really uncomfortable. And at the same time, Scott is ushering Ricky closer to the campfire to take a seat next to Sean. Sean's a great cook. He'll cook up this fish for us. It's going to be great. Take a seat. Ricky felt kind of annoyed that Scott was really forcing him to stay. But Ricky didn't want to be rude and just kind of abruptly leave, so he did take a seat next to Sean, who definitely was not excited to be sitting next to Ricky, and Ricky just kind of sat there waiting to see what would happen next. And what happened next is Scott walked over to Sean and handed off all the fish that he and Ricky had caught so that Sean could begin to prepare them, to cook them. And then as Ricky is still just sitting there right next to Sean, Scott walked away from the campfire up to his truck, which was parked right next to Sean's Jeep. And Scott turned on the radio and began blasting country music. And when Ricky heard this music, he kind of winced because to him, part of the reason the outdoors, the Appalachian Trail, being out in nature, part of the reason it was so wonderful was for the peace and quiet. And so it felt kind of like borderline disrespectful to be out in the middle of this beautiful place, blaring country music. And so to Ricky, he just couldn't help but feel like, there's something off about these two guys. They just seem really disrespectful and kind of pushy and maybe aggressive. And so Ricky is just not happy. But again, Ricky didn't say anything and didn't attempt to leave because again, he's really hungry and so is his dog and he needs to eat that fish. A moment later, Scott walked back from the truck and took a seat next to Sean, and then he, along with Sean, pulled out their knives and began deboning the fish. And as they were doing this, Ricky, again, is just kind of sitting there doing nothing, and so he kind of meagerly asked, hey, can you give me a knife and I'll clean a fish? But Sean and Scott kind of waved him off and said, don't worry, we got this. And so Ricky just continued to sit there nervously, as all he could watch was the flashing of the light bouncing off their blades. But eventually, Scott and Sean finished deboning all the fish, and they put their knives away, and at that point, they began cooking the fish over the open flame. And suddenly for Ricky, it felt like, the mood had shifted a little bit. At least now the two men were not fiddling around with weapons. It felt kind of safe again. And so Ricky began making some small talk in hopes that would kind of, settle his nerves. And so Ricky told the two men about how much he loved the Appalachian Trail and how he came out here all the time for weeks at a time with his dog. And Ricky would tell the men that, sometimes he felt more at home out in the wild than he did at home. It was almost like being out in nature was a religious experience for Ricky. And he would even tell Sean and Scott that sometimes when he was out in nature, he would meditate and pray and even do some chanting like part of a ritual. I mean, he was really trying to be in tune with Mother Nature. But as Ricky continued to tell Sean and Scott about his personal life, he noticed the two men were definitely paying attention and kind of nodding along at appropriate points in the story. But at the same time, Ricky felt like these two men were also kind of looking at him like Ricky was kind of weird, as if they were not prepared to come out and say it. But after hearing all these things about his life, it was like, what's going on with this guy? And so Ricky suddenly felt really embarrassed about being so open with these two guys who once again just seem like they don't quite like him or even really want him here. But luckily, right at that moment, the fish were done, and so the men just sat there in silence and wolfed down the food. By the time they finished, right about 8 p.m., it was very dark outside, and Ricky at this point is just ready to go. He just felt so uneasy here. And so after putting down his plate and his silverware and saying thank you to Sean and Scott for their hospitality, he quickly got up and grabbed his dog, and he began walking into the woods towards his campsite. But after Ricky and his dog had walked maybe 10 or 15 feet away from this campsite, two things happened in rapid succession. Number one, Ricky suddenly stopped and turned around and looked back at the campsite. And number two, right as he did this, there was this enormous bang sound, like a small explosion that echoed through the forest. About 30 minutes later, and about 4 miles away from where Ricky and Sean and Scott had been, there were these two women who were in their house eating dinner when they heard the sudden frantic knocking on their front door. Now, these women live in a very isolated part of the country, and so the women were very concerned. One of them rushed over to the phone just to be ready to call the police, while the other very carefully made their way towards the front of the house, and they kind of peered out the window, but they couldn't see anything outside. It was too dark, and so they went to their door, which was still getting pounded on by whoever was out there, and the woman, she unlocked the door, and she opened it just a crack, and what she saw nearly made her faint. There was a man standing on her porch who was absolutely covered in blood, as if he had been fully submerged in a tank of blood. I mean, he is all red. And the man had his hand over his neck. And the woman who opened the door, she looked at him and she saw that there was this rhythmic pulsing of blood pumping out of his neck that was in time with his heart. This man is clearly bleeding to death. And so the woman, she screamed for the other woman to please call 911. We have someone who's dying here. And so she began calling 911. And then the man on the porch just said, please help me. And then he said something about Dismal Creek. And then he collapsed. And this was so shocking for the woman who had opened the door that she just stood there staring, having no idea what to do. But then she happened to look up and she noticed there was a Jeep that was idling out on the road in front of her house that she hadn't even registered until now. And so either this guy got dropped off or he drove that Jeep. But before she could even begin to understand what had just happened, an ambulance and a whole bunch of police cars came screaming up and parked in front of her house. And then the medics got out, they rushed up, and they grabbed the bleeding man, and they put him in the ambulance, and they rushed him off. Meanwhile, not far from the house, police officers were speeding towards Dismal Creek because when the women called 911, they said, this guy who's shown up on the porch bleeding said something about Dismal Creek, but they had no idea what it was about. And so instead of trying to wait to figure out what was even going on, police had basically said, let's just go to Dismal Creek and look around and see if we can figure out, why someone would leave that area and show up at this house covered in blood. But as the police were making their way up this winding mountain road, they saw a truck bombing down the road coming straight at them. And the truck, they initially hit their brakes and did kind of attempt to get out of the way of the police cars. But after this truck had basically come to a stop, the driver of the truck just hit the gas all over again, and they veered wildly off the side of the road into an embankment, and they crashed and flipped several times and then came to a stop. And the police officers who had veered to the side of the road to avoid getting hit by this truck, they just watched this happen and they couldn't understand why the driver had gunned it again after stopping and then seemingly intentionally drove off the road. It almost seemed like the driver was trying to crash. And so the police, they got out of their car and they approached the wrecked truck with their guns drawn. But when they looked into the vehicle, they saw there was a single occupant, the driver, and he was still somehow alive. So the police got him out of the vehicle and they called an ambulance, but they actually sent an officer with the ambulance to escort them because the police were actually pretty suspicious of this truck driver. Because remember, they were going up that road to get to Dismal Creek to see what had happened there that would lead to another man showing up on somebody's doorstep in the middle of the night covered in blood. And now they have this truck driver who looks like he's speeding away from Dismal Creek, who crashes his truck. I mean, there was no clear connection between the truck crash and the bloody guy, but the police were suspicious that they had to be connected. So they sent the officer to the hospital as well. About 30 minutes after the truck crash, the police left the scene and continued the rest of the way up the road to Dismal Creek. And once they got up there, the police fanned out all across the area and just began looking for anything. Just any clue that might explain what the heck happened here, if anything happened at Dismal Creek at all. And pretty quickly, the police actually did find something unique. In the middle of the Dismal Creek area, they found a campsite. But it was not the campsite where Sean and Scott were staying, where Ricky had gone and shared dinner with them. This was a different campsite. And not long after searching this other campsite, police concluded that whoever was staying here did not seem like they were mentally well. This seems like a mentally unstable and potentially dangerous person lives here. So the campsite was really simple. It was just a tent and a campfire. But when the police lifted up the flap and looked inside the tent, they found a collection of 30 knives along with a police scanner that basically picked up police radio chatter in the area. So you could listen to a scanner and basically know what the police were doing in your area. There were also all these weird piles of clothing. Some were for kids, some were for adults, some were for men, some were for women. There were piles of eyeglasses, and there were 8 pairs of women's underwear. And then also there was a map of the Appalachian Trail inside of this tent, and all over this map along the trail were all these spots that were circled, but there was no information about what these circles meant. However, one of the places that was circled was Dismal Creek. And then next to the map was a radio, and inside the radio was a cassette. And so the police just hit play, and immediately what they heard totally creeped them out, because the tape sounded like some kind of satanic ritual. It was basically this one man's voice just kind of howling and chanting over and over again. But by far, the most shocking thing that was found inside of that tent was a single piece of paper. And this piece of paper was a birth certificate, and the name on the birth certificate was a name that basically all police in this area knew, and in fact, anybody living in or around the Appalachian Trail definitely would know this name. And the identity of this person, the name on the birth certificate, was the key to putting together all these seemingly disconnected events that had happened on this night. From the explosion when Ricky walked away from the fire, to the bloody man at the house, to the truck crash, they were all connected through this single person. A few hours earlier, after Ricky had gotten up and walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite, and then after barely making it onto the trail, he had turned around and there was that loud explosion. Well, at that point in the story, Ricky, who's now looking back at the campsite and looking at Sean and Scott, he can see that the two of them, they've heard the sound too, and they were now staring at each other with looks of absolute shock and terror on their faces. But then Ricky watched as Sean reached up and touched his face, and he put his hand out in front of his face and it was covered in red. And the reason for that was because Sean had just been shot in the face, because that loud explosion was the sound of Ricky shooting his gun at Sean. And as Sean and Scott stood there staring at each other in absolute disbelief, Ricky, who's still in the tree line, ran towards the fire and just kept on shooting. And so Sean at this point, as he sees Ricky coming into the campsite, he stands up and kind of staggers back and falls on the ground. But Scott, who's not hurt at this point, he just gets up and starts running away from the campsite. And Ricky turns his attention towards Scott and he shoots at him and he hits him straight in the neck and also in the back. But somehow Scott just kept on running despite these horrible wounds. And so Ricky watched as Scott disappeared into the woods. And then Ricky turned back to Sean, who's laying on the ground and can't go anywhere. He's been shot in the face. And Ricky just casually raised his gun and shot Sean right in the chest. But amazingly, Sean, after getting shot the second time, it created what must have been the most extreme adrenaline rush ever, because he jumped up to his feet and right in front of his attacker, he just turned and sprinted to his Jeep. He hopped inside, fired it up, and just sped away as fast as he could. And when Sean flipped on his headlights and turned a corner after getting away from the campsite, he looked down the road and he actually saw his buddy, Scott, who had run away first, come tumbling out of the woods onto the road. And so Sean, who's gravely injured, drives over next to Scott and he stops the Jeep long enough for Scott to climb inside, and they shut the door and they speed their way towards the nearest help, which happened to be that house where those two women lived. And so it was Scott, who looked like he was drenched in blood, who knocked on the women's door. Sean was down in the Jeep out on the road, but he was just too weak to get out and come up to the door as well. But when the ambulance and police arrived, they would find not only Scott up on the porch, but also Sean in the Jeep, and both men would be taken to the hospital via helicopter. And then as for the man who was driving the truck down the road away from Dismal Creek, who then crashed right in front of the police, well, the driver of that truck was Ricky Williams. However, that was not his real name. There was no Ricky Williams. That was the name he just used. His real name, which was on the birth certificate that police found in that other campsite inside of the tent, was Randall Lee Smith. The same infamous Randall Lee Smith who had murdered those two hikers not far from Dismal Creek. That double homicide had happened in 1981, and Randall was caught and convicted. But he was paroled 15 years later in 1996 for good behavior. And for 10 years after that, Randall lived with his mother and he wore this electronic bracelet and, he followed the rules. But by 2008, his electronic bracelet had came off, and even though Randall had attempted to continue living with his mother, it just wasn't tenable. He didn't have enough money, and so ultimately he packed up his things, grabbed his dog, and moved out onto the Appalachian Trail. And on May 6th, 2008, when Sean and Scott arrived in Dismal Creek to go fishing, Randall was waiting. Nobody has any idea why Randall murdered those two hikers back in 1981 or why he targeted Sean and Scott in 2008. All we know is that Randall Lee Smith was very mentally unwell and very likely viewed the Appalachian Trail as like his sacred place. This is his home. This is the place he loves more than anything. And so maybe, he felt like Sean and Scott had somehow disrespected the Appalachian Trail, and that was enough to attack them. Now, we know Sean and Scott did not do anything intentionally disrespectful to Randall because, amazingly, Sean and Scott survived this attack. And they would say that when they saw Randall, they just felt bad for him. They thought he was like this alcoholic drifter who didn't have a home of his own, and so he was just living out in the woods on the Appalachian Trail. And so they didn't judge him. Instead, they really did just want to give him some food and spend some time with him and make him feel human again. That was it. And because Randall appeared to be this kind of small, older man, Sean and Scott, who were, very big and imposing, they didn't feel threatened by this guy. As for that bizarre other campsite that police found up around Dismal Creek, the one that contained all those knives and the birth certificate, well, obviously, that was Randall's campsite. And that weird cassette tape that they listened to that sounded like a satanic ritual, That was Randall going through his meditations and chants that he would do when he was out in the middle of nowhere. It was like his way of respecting Mother Nature and the Appalachian Trail. And then all those items that were found inside of his tent, the different clothes and the eyeglasses and the women's underwear, it's believed those could be Randall's other victims. However, when police pulled DNA samples from all of those items that were found inside of his tent, like the clothes and the underwear and the eyeglasses, well, those DNA samples did not match any of the missing people or murder victims in the police's database, and so that wasn't useful. And then also, police went to all those places on that map that were circled, and with the exception of obviously Dismal Creek, they didn't find anything else at the other locations that suggested any violent event had happened there. So only Randall knows the truth, which means we will never know the truth, because just 4 days after Randall was pulled out of that truck that he crashed, he died in police custody from a blood clot that formed as a result of the crash. And in those 4 days that Randall was in custody, he never gave up that there were any other victims. Today, Sean still has a bullet in his head and in his chest, and Scott still has big scarring on his neck and on his back. But both men have made a full recovery, relatively speaking, and they still go back to Dismal Creek all the time to go camping and fishing. On the evening of July 25th, 2008, a 59-year-old man named Brian Thomas walked hand in hand with his wife Christine out of the restaurant where they had just had dinner. The couple was in this little village right on the coast of Wales, and where they were now walking outside of this restaurant was right along the water. And so as they did that, Brian found himself looking out over the sea, and he saw the reflection of the moon on the waves, and it was so beautiful. And then he turned to his wife, and she was so stunning. And so Brian finally just stopped and kind of just took in all this incredible beauty right in front of him, and he began smiling ear to ear, which was a big departure from how Brian had been feeling over the past few months, because Christine had recently had a big scare. She'd been told she might have cancer, and so she went in for all this testing, and then she and Brian had to wait for it to come back, and the wait was absolute torture. I mean, basically Brian and Christine were prepping themselves to find out Christine really did have cancer. But when the results did come back, it would turn out Christine did not have cancer, and so Christine was obviously hugely relieved, but it was actually Brian who was more relieved. It was like he suddenly saw he could lose his wife of 40 years, who he had raised a family with. I mean, this was like the most important person in Brian's life, but it was like he didn't fully appreciate that until he realized he could lose this really important person. And so now that Christine had a clean bill of health, Brian was committed to showering her with love and affection and taking her to restaurants and on vacations. And in fact, the reason they were actually in this village in Wales is because they were on one of Brian's many vacations for Christine. He had gone out and bought this little camper van, and they had driven it up to this part of Wales. And then after this vacation ended, Brian's plan was to use this camper to travel with his wife all over Great Britain. And so the couple had a really busy schedule coming up. But for right now, Brian was focused on just staying in the moment and enjoying this newfound happiness he was feeling. And so he and his wife would continue to just kind of walk along the water for a bit. And then finally, when they felt tired, they headed back to their camper, they went inside, they got in their bed, and they fell asleep. A little before 4 a.m., Brian suddenly woke up inside of this camper. And so he sits upright and looks around. You know, it's totally dark inside of there. He can't see anything. He doesn't really know why he just woke up. And he's trying to get his bearings. And then as his eyes kind of begin to focus, he realizes there is a person standing inside of their camper right near the door. Basically 10, 15 feet away from he and his wife is a person. And so Brian just froze and he's staring at this person, hoping this is just a dream or something. But then this person, who appeared to be dressed in all black head to toe, began to move. And they began to move first to the left and then towards the bed. And so Brian is still just frozen, thinking, is this real? Is this really happening? And then this person began climbing on the bed on the side where Christine was. And so Brian, without even thinking, just yelled out, "You bastard!" And he jumped off the bed at this guy and began choking them out. And the whole time Brian is screaming at this person, like, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" And this person is fighting back so hard, and Brian is just not letting go. It's like instinct is completely taken over. And then this person
goes totally still and just dies. And Brian knows he killed them, but they came into his camper. Like, what do you expect?
Brian would ultimately be the one who called the police, and just several minutes later, they would show up, and when they got there, they would find Brian standing outside the camper hyperventilating, and then when they tried to get more information about what exactly had happened inside the camper, Brian basically couldn't explain it. It was like he was totally in shock. And so eventually, one of the officers just went inside the camper, and there on the ground, they would find a body. But it was not some attacker. It was Brian's wife. It would turn out Brian had a medical condition called somnambulism, which we know as sleepwalking. And at home, he would sleep in a different bed than his wife because he sleepwalked so much. But since they were on vacation in their camper, they had to sleep together because there was only one bed on board the camper. And so not long after Brian and Christine had fallen asleep together, Brian began having this really intense nightmare where he believed his wife was being attacked. And so Brian, in this nightmare, had to stop this person from hurting Christine. Except, because of his sleepwalking, he acted this out in real life. And the attacker that he ultimately killed was ironically his wife. He basically tackled his wife and strangled her to death because he thought he was actually saving her. Brian was absolutely destroyed with grief and with guilt, and the second he realized what he had done, he confessed. He didn't in any way try to protect himself. He said, "I did this, take me in." And Brian would be arrested. However, in November of 2009, the judge who actually heard Brian's official confession, he kind of felt bad for Brian and said, "You know what? I'm dropping all charges against you because it's obvious to me you are a good and decent person. This was a mistake, and you're going to live with grief and guilt for the rest of your life, and that's punishment enough." At 5 a.m. on September 30th, 2008, a 61-year-old man named Xian Tie-xiong finished getting dressed inside of the bedroom that he shared with his wife in the city of Beijing, China. After he finished getting dressed, Xian reached down and scooped up his backpack off the floor that was already packed, and then as quietly as he could, he kind of tiptoed around the bed to his wife's side to give her a kiss goodbye. Xian was going to be heading out to a local mountain that day for a day hike. And so Xian, he gets next to his wife and he bends down to kiss her, and right as he does that, he accidentally wakes her up. And so his wife opens her eyes and she looks up at him, and Xian just says, "You know, I love you." He gives her a kiss and he tells her, "Hey, I'll be back tonight before midnight." And so his wife, she kind of groggily said okay, and she grabbed his hand and squeezed it, and she told him that she loved him, and then she fell back asleep, and moments later, Xian had left the bedroom and walked out the front door. Xian's home was only a couple of blocks away from the train station, and since he needed to ride a train and then also a bus to get to this local mountain that was about an hour-and-a-half journey away, the train station was his first stop. And so Xian, as he walked towards the station, he was all smiles. I mean, he was really excited about this day. So Xian was retired, but he had spent his whole life teaching geography at Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And he was a very passionate teacher, but the thing he was most passionate about, that he routinely really pushed on his students, in some ways more than geography, was his love of nature. In fact, Xian loved nature so much that when he was not teaching, he basically spent all of his off time out in nature going for hikes. I mean, that was his thing. And today, Xian was especially excited about his hike because he was hiking one of his favorite trails. It was located on Mount Miaofeng, which is a mountain located 30 miles to the northwest of where Xian lived. And this mountain was quite famous because of all the sacred and ancient temples that kind of dotted the mountain all over the place. And then also there were all these beautiful roses, like the flower, that would bloom all over the mountain in the summer. And so it's just this totally strikingly beautiful place. And normally Xian would actually hike up this trail and then actually camp out on Mount Miaofeng, mostly because on the summit there was this incredible view of downtown Beijing. And at night, the view is like spectacular with the city all lit up. But on this particular day, Xian knew an overnight stay was not possible because he had to be back home by the next day because it was his mother's 90th birthday. And he was very close with his mother, and he was not going to miss that. And so Xian eventually made it to the train station. He bought his ticket, he boarded his train, and then he sat down in a seat. And as soon as he did, he opened up his bag and pulled out a stack of papers. For this hike, Xian had packed himself some food and water inside of his backpack. He also packed a newspaper called the Beijing Youth Daily, and he brought along his diary. But his diary was a little bit unique.
Jian, because he loved nature so much and didn't like the idea of wasting anything, what he would do when he was a teacher at Beijing No. 5 Middle School, he would just take scrap paper and start writing on that. And he would compile all his scrap paper into these sort of diaries that he would keep. And so the reason he did that was primarily because he was so in love with nature, he hated the idea of wasting anything. And so Jian passed the time on the train by writing in his diary, aka his stack of scrap paper, and also reading this newspaper. And Jian knew he really needed to read the entire newspaper pretty quickly, because by the time he got to the mountain, he was going to do what he always did, which is he would bring a newspaper with him on a hike, and as he walked, he would take out a page periodically and tie it to a tree, kind of marking his way. That way, when he turned around and came back down, he would have his path marked, because Jian did not always walk on a clearly marked trail, and so this was his way of not getting lost. And so Jian would ride the train car, and then he would get off and he would board a bus, and then finally, right around 7 a.m., that bus would come to a stop in the tiny village of Changfang, which is located right at the base of Mount Miaofeng. And so Jian grabbed his backpack, he hopped off the bus, and then began walking through the village towards the mountain. And then by about 7:20 a.m., so not long after Jian had left the bus, he was almost up to Mount Miaofeng when he pulled out his cell phone and he called his cousin. It was a brief conversation, and all Jian really wanted to do was just to make sure his cousin was going to be around the next day for Jian's mother's birthday. And the cousin said he would, and so Jian told him, okay, I'm going hiking today, and I will see you tomorrow. And then he hung up. And then, only a couple minutes later, Jian disappeared into the beautiful forests of Mount Miaofeng. So Jian's wife did not expect to hear from Jian at any point that day because she knew he would have terrible cell phone service up on the mountain. But she did expect her husband to be home on time. He had told her that morning before he left that he would be home that night before midnight. And if you knew Jian, you knew this guy was never late. He said, I'm going to be someplace at a certain time, he would be there. So when 10 p.m. rolled around that night, and still Jian was not back yet, and he had not called, Jian's wife was actually not worried, because she was thinking, okay, well, it's 10, he'll be home in the next couple of hours, because he said he'd be here by midnight tonight, and he will be here tonight. And so she went to bed expecting to wake up and see Jian in bed with her in the morning. But the next morning when she woke up, Jian was not in bed, so he did not come home, and so his wife immediately was very concerned and began calling Jian's family, and nobody knew where he was. And so that day, the family went to the police, and they reported Jian missing. The local police immediately organized a search for Jian. However, they knew this was going to be a very challenging search. Mount Miaofeng is not some enormous mountain by any means. It's a decent-sized mountain, but, it's really known for having these paths that twist and turn all over the place, so it's pretty easy to get lost. And then also there's a whole bunch of sheer cliff faces kind of all over the place, so if you're not paying attention, you could literally just walk off a ledge. So in short, this is a dangerous and confusing place. And at the same time that this search was happening out on the mountain, the police were also in contact with Jian's cell phone service provider to see if they could track down Jian's cell phone, because obviously if they could find that, they might find Jian too. But the only way a cell phone can be tracked is if the cell phone is on, because when it's on, it connects to the nearest cell phone tower, and that's how these service providers are able to tell where these phones are. They look to see which tower it's connected to. But when Jian's cell phone service provider looked for his phone, they quickly determined his phone was off. So unless the phone came back on again, they would not be able to locate the phone. However, they were able to pull all of Jian's cell phone signal history up until his phone was turned off. And what they found in the signal history is the day before, so the day Jian went missing, his cell phone was on at 4 p.m. that evening, and he received a phone call at 4 p.m. And the service provider was able to see that when this phone call came in, Jian's cell phone was not where they thought it would be. It was not high up Mount Miaofeng. It actually was near the base of the mountain. And when police reached out to the person who had called Jian at 4 p.m., they discovered it was just a friend of Jian's, and this friend said that Jian said he was coming down the mountain now and he'd be home soon. So this new information did basically line up with what Jian had told his family he'd be doing that day, just a quick day hike. Although again, they kind of expected it to be a little bit longer. It seemed a little odd he'd be down the mountain by 4 p.m., but still, this basically lined up with what they thought he was doing. However, this new information did not help explain what happened to Jian. Like, why was he missing? The expectation was he must have gotten lost or hurt or something up on this mountain. Maybe he's stranded somewhere and can't go anywhere. But now, based on this phone call, it sounded an awful lot like Jian was not even on the mountain when he disappeared. So where was he? Police had already checked all the bus stations and train stations in the area, to see if maybe Jian took a different way home or something. But when they went to all these different stations, there was no evidence that Jian had been to any of them. And there was another problem. Members of Jian's family told the police about Jian's habit of tying newspapers to trees to mark his trail as he hiked. And the family told the police that Jian did this every single time he hiked. And his wife told the police that for sure she knew her husband had brought along a copy of that newspaper. So by all expectations, there should be markers up on that mountain, literally leading searchers to wherever Jian went. But after an entire day of searching Mount Miaofeng, they didn't find a single newspaper anywhere. For the next several days, this big search for Jian continued, but nothing was found. That is, until October 7th, so 1 week after Jian had vanished. On that day, Jian's cell phone service provider noticed that Jian's cell phone had suddenly turned back on. And the phone was not on or near Mount Miaofeng. Instead, it was located 36 miles away from the mountain at a train station called Beijing West Railway Station. Now, the cell phone was only on for a couple of seconds, but it was on long enough for the provider to confirm that it really was in that location. And so the police immediately dispatched a team to go to Beijing West Railway Station and see if they could find Jian. But when they got there, Jian was not there, his phone was not there. They looked at all the security footage, there was no sign of Jian. They searched the surrounding areas. Nothing. And on this day, at basically the same time that police are at this railway station trying to make sense of, what's going on with the cell phone, a villager from Chanfang village, which is that little village that sits at the base of Mount Miaofeng, came forward with a very strange story. He said on the day that Jian disappeared, this villager was at his little shop. He sold walnuts to hikers that were making their way towards Mount Miaofeng. It was basically like snacks for the hike. And he sees this guy walking up through the village towards the mountain, and he looked exactly like Jian, because now Jian's face was on the news and this villager had seen it, and so he felt like he had seen Jian. And so this villager said, this guy who looked exactly like Jian, he walked up and actually stopped at this villager's shop to buy some walnuts. And this villager and this man who looked like Jian, they just chatted for a few minutes. And at some point, this guy who looked like Jian, asked the villager, hey, these are great, but where else can I buy walnuts? I want to buy other types of walnuts and bring them back to my family. And so this villager was like, oh yeah, well, the best walnuts in all of Beijing are actually located about 30 miles away at the base of another mountain. It's called Tietua Mountain, and there are vendors over there who sell the best walnuts. So that's your answer right over there. And then after the villager said this guy who looked just like Jian, it's like everything changed for him. It's like his expression changed, his tone changed. It's like he's been given this information that's changed his life, about these walnuts. And he says to the villager, okay, I'm gonna go there right now. And without saying anything else, this man just turned and began quickly walking away from the walnuts, back through town, back towards the bus stop. So away from Mount Miaofeng. In theory, this guy is going to the bus to commute 30 miles to this other mountain, Tietua Mountain, to get these walnuts? I mean, the villager does not know this guy, but even he felt like this is bizarre. This guy comes up, he's buying snacks to go hike Mount Miaofeng. He seems really excited about it. And I offhandedly mention these walnuts, and he's like, boom, I'm out of here. I'm going to go 30 miles to this other mountain to get these walnuts. It just seemed weird. And then when police spoke to Jian's family about this new information, they would learn that Jian did not have a special interest in walnuts, and neither did his family. And even if there was a reason why Jian just really wanted these walnuts, he would not have had time in that day to take the bus 30 miles to Tiatua Mountain, get these walnuts, go 30 miles back, and hike up Mount Miaofeng, because he can't stay the night. He needs to come back tonight in order to go to his mother's birthday party the next day. So it just made no sense. But this walnut thing was basically the only lead police really had, because everything else was a dead end. And so they decided to shift their search area from Mount Miaofeng to Tiatua Mountain. And pretty much right away, they saw something that gave them hope that Jian could be here. They found pages from the Beijing Youth Daily newspaper tied to trees on the mountain. And when they looked more closely at the newspapers, they found the publication date of this newspaper lined up with the copy that Jian would have had with him on the day he vanished. And so, of course, the searchers just began following this trail of newspapers, hoping Jian would be at the other end. For 2 days, searchers very diligently followed this trail up the mountain. It kind of wound around, and they went pretty slowly because as they're moving, they're constantly checking everything around. They don't want to miss any clues. But finally, after 2 days of following this trail, they eventually found something. The newspapers led them to a campsite. Now, the campsite was abandoned, but there was a bed of hay, there was some used water bottles, and some toilet paper. And so just from the looks of it, this campsite looked relatively active, like somebody had been staying here recently for at least a day or two. And so it seemed pretty likely, based on everything else, that this was Jian's campsite. And pretty quickly, after searching the campsite, they found something that virtually guaranteed that this was his campsite. Authorities found this plastic bag that was sitting next to the bed, and inside of the bag was a piece of scrap paper from Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And on this scrap paper was a note. And the note said Jian had indeed hiked up Tiatua Mountain on September 30th. This would have been the day that he left, so the day he disappeared. And then on his way down, he said he got lost and was forced to spend the night out here. And so that explained the campsite. And then on October 1st, so that would have been the day after he spent the night out here, he said he was going to attempt to follow the ridge line down the mountain to a nearby village to safety. And this note ended with the phrase, "Leaving this note here just in case. Love to everyone who passes by." Now, at first glance, this note was like amazing news, because suddenly it seemed totally possible that Jian was just fine. I mean, the way the note was written, it sounded like he was at least healthy and safe, albeit I'm sure he was not happy to be stuck up on a mountain, but, he loved being in nature, and so he seemed okay. And then he had a reasonable plan for how he was going to get out of there, follow the ridgeline, go down to a village, go to safety. But as the police analyzed this note, they noticed that some things were off about it. First of all, this note basically directly contradicts other facts of this case. Remember, cell phone records prove Jian got a phone call at 4 p.m. on the day he went missing from his friend, and his friend would report that Jian told him that he was coming down Mount Miaofeng and he'd be home soon. But according to the note they found, that was not possible, because the note said Jian at 4 p.m. on September 30th, the day he went missing, he would have been on Tiatua Mountain, either hiking up or being in the process of getting lost and, ultimately making that campsite where he camped out for at least one night. And so in addition to this factual discrepancy with this note, another issue with the note was just the way it was written. Now, Jian's wife had a chance to look at the note, and she would say, "That is my husband's handwriting." But the note contained a bunch of very strange language choices that just didn't make sense for Jian to be using. For example, this note, which really should have been a first-person point of view, Jian has gotten lost, he's by himself, he's writing to the world, kind of letting somebody know what's going on with him, and so it really should have been written in the first person. "My name is Jian, I am lost, here's what I'm doing." But the note was written in the third person. Jian got lost on the mountain, and so he is going to camp out for the night, and tomorrow he's going to make his way out to safety. But despite being written in the third person, it did sound like somebody was talking about themselves. It did not feel like somebody else was attempting to document what Jian was doing. But by far, the weirdest part of this note was the tone shift that happened about halfway through. So the first half of this letter was written, albeit in the third person, but it was grammatically correct and sort of formal, like you would expect from a very well-educated retired teacher. But once you get to that second half of the note, the grammar started being really awkward. And then the very final line, which says, "Love to everyone who passes by," that actually sounds totally awkward in Chinese. So "love to everyone who passes by" is the translation into English, and that basically makes sense to us. Like, that's not an awkward phrase. But if you put it back in Chinese, it's so awkward. It would be like if I tried to say to you, "I take the bus to work," but instead I said, "To work, take bus." Right? Like, I wouldn't say it that way, and it would immediately seem very awkward for anybody who knows me if I wrote or said something like that. And so this last line stood out so much that actually police and friends and family of Jian assumed he must have left that in there as like a secret message or a code, like a distress signal, especially when you consider the other weird factors around this note. But nobody could figure out what it meant. The day after this note was discovered, a searcher was up in the vicinity of Jian's campsite on Tietua Mountain, and they were walking around, kind of retracing their footsteps, looking for new places to search. When they turned a corner, and up ahead, they noticed there was this tree kind of hanging out over this rocky cliff, and dangling from the tree was something gray that looked sort of out of place. And so the searcher, sensing this could be a clue of Jian's whereabouts, he yelled out for other searchers in the area that he had found something, and then he took off running towards this thing to see what it was. And when he got up to the tree, he looked up and he saw it was a pair of sweatpants that had clearly been intentionally tied to this branch in the tree. And so the searcher, he reached up and grabbed one of the pant legs and kind of tugged on it. And when he did, all these white things began falling out of the pants and landing on the ground. And when the searcher stopped and looked down to see what they were, he couldn't believe it. It was a whole pile of human bones. However, they were not Jian's. In fact, nobody ever figured out who these bones belonged to or why they were stuffed inside of pants and tied to a tree on this mountain. But the discovery of these bones would open up a whole new mystery, because after these bones were found, all the searchers came over and basically just began combing the area near these bones, and the police began uncovering body after body after body. They found 2 more sets of human bones stuffed into pants and tied to trees, and they found the other bodies at the foot of a cliff, and also inside of this well, and inside of this cave. And so in total, authorities found 10 sets of human remains in the vicinity near Jian's campsite, but none of the human remains belonged to Jian. Officials were only able to identify a few of the bodies, and they were not able to figure out how they died or whether or not foul play was involved. But the discovery of those bodies did mean one thing for Jian's case. It meant, all these people had previously gone up Tietua Mountain before Jian went up and vanished. And when these other people went up the mountain, clearly something horrible happened to them, and we don't know what it is. Is there a killer on the loose? Is there some animal or creature out there that's taken people out? We don't know. But what started to happen since Xian went missing and his story was all over the news in China is that all these other hikers who've been on Tietua Mountain before have begun sharing their experiences when they hiked up Tietua Mountain, and some of their stories about what they've seen on that mountain are horrifying. One person said they were walking up the mountain. They had their partner with them who was a little bit farther back the trail. And so they're kind of walking up on their own. And the first person, as they're walking up the trail, suddenly sees this guy just kind of come out of nowhere wielding an axe. And he walks up to this person and all he says is, "Are you alone?" And the hiker's like, "No, my partner's back there. They're coming up here. What's going on?" But the axe man, he basically acted like he didn't even hear their answer. And he just asked it again, "Are you alone?" And the hiker was like, "No, my partner's back there." And the axe man again just said, "Are you alone? Are you alone? Are you alone?" And this axe person kept doing that until the hiker and their partner just turned and ran. And then another hiker shared a story about how they were walking up a trail on Tietua Mountain, and at some point they lifted their head up, and he saw a little ways up the trail, kind of off the trail, so in the tree line, were all these people, like this group of strangers, just standing there motionless, kind of half behind trees, like they were kind of trying to hide themselves, but also not. And they were just staring at this hiker, unmoving, not speaking, just staring. And so the hiker, they look up and they see this, and they were so unnerved so quickly that they just turned and left, and they have no idea who those people were. And so obviously we have no way of verifying these other hikers' stories about what they saw on Tietua Mountain. But when you combine their testimony with Jian's story, it really makes you wonder, what's going on up there? The official search for Jian was called off at the end of October, so roughly 1 month after he vanished. But unofficially, the search for Jian continues to this day. However, they still have not found his body, and basically no real progress has been made. One morning in January of 2016, a 45-year-old woman named Lauren walked into an office building in West Virginia where she worked as an office manager, and she dropped her purse, her phone, and her cigarettes on her desk. It was a Friday, and so Lauren was in a really good mood because she was pumped about the weekend. The next day, Saturday, she and her husband Dan planned to go on this big hike together. They loved hiking, so that was going to be awesome. And then on Sunday, Lauren planned to stay home all day and cook one big meal because it had become a tradition in their family that on Sundays, Lauren and Dan's kids, they had 3 kids who were all grown up, they would come back home to their parents' house and they would have a big family meal together. And these dinners were definitely the highlight of the week for Lauren and for Dan because both of them were very family-centric. Lauren switched on her computer and then looked at her schedule and saw she had a whole bunch of meetings back to back to back that day. And so immediately she was worried that she would not be able to slip out that day and go for a quick walk, something she had recently been doing a lot of because her doctor had recently told her that she had a blood circulation disorder that was called peripheral vascular disease. And what that meant was the arteries that carried the blood from her heart down to her legs and her feet were becoming blocked. And so her legs and feet were not getting enough oxygen. So far, her only symptoms were the occasional leg cramp, but if the disease got worse, it could lead to pain and mobility issues, and also heart attack and stroke. Luckily, Lauren's doctor told her that she didn't need medication, she just needed to quit smoking, change her diet, and become more physically active. And Lauren had totally leaned into this, and was being much more active, and had changed her diet. She hadn't quit smoking yet, but she planned to. And so Lauren really felt like she was on the right track. And so as Lauren kind of began her day, going through her emails and thinking about when she's going to do this walk, her cell phone rang. When Lauren looked at the phone, she didn't recognize the number, so she decided to let it go to voicemail. And so Lauren forgot about her phone and just figured whoever this was, they'd call back or whatever, and she's doing her thing. But then she got another phone call. And when she looked, it was the same number calling her back. And this time, Lauren did pick up the phone, and when she said hello, on the other end of the line, she heard a police officer say in a very serious voice, "Am I speaking to Dan's wife?" And so right away, Lauren's heart began to race, and she would tell the officer, yes, what's going on? And all the officer would tell her is that Dan, unfortunately, was in a very serious car accident, and so you need to come to the scene right away. In an absolute panic, Lauren hung up the phone, she grabbed her things, she ran out to the car, and she floored her way to the address the police officer gave her. But when she got there, she saw there were so many police cars and ambulances and all these people that she couldn't even see what was going on, let alone park anywhere near where this accident happened. So she wound up parking her car around the corner, and then she got out and just sprinted towards all the police. And then when she got up to them, she basically began pushing people out of the way, and no one tried to stop her. They could tell, this woman must know the people involved in this crash. And so she pushed past all these people, and finally she can see through the crowd, and she can see her husband's car, and it's absolutely mangled. And there's all these first responders that are in a circle on the pavement, and she can tell there is somebody on the ground they're working on, and it's got to be Dan. And so Lauren just began running towards that group of people, and as she did, they all stood up as if, there was nothing they could do. And on the ground, Lauren saw her husband. There was Dan lying in this huge pool of blood, just motionless on the ground. And so before she even got over to her husband, Lauren already knew what had happened. Dan was dead. And so Lauren let out this primal shriek and just rushed over to her husband and fell to the ground next to him, holding his body and crying hysterically. And all the EMTs and first responders, they knew this woman has just lost her husband. And even though she shouldn't be here right now, they just felt like they have to give this moment to her. And so the police and the EMTs and the rest of the first responders, instead of even talking to Lauren or trying to get her to go somewhere else, they just formed a big circle, shoulder to shoulder, around Lauren and Dan, and just allowed Lauren to grieve in private. About 2 hours later, Lauren returned to her home in a daze. Dan's body had already been transported to the morgue, and a police officer had driven Lauren back to her home where her 3 kids, her son and her 2 daughters, were now waiting for her. And so when Lauren went inside the house and went into the living room where her kids were, her kids, who already knew what had happened, they just immediately swarmed her and hugged her, and they all just cried together. I mean, this was so horrible and so unexpected that nobody knew what to do. Finally, Lauren tried to speak through her sobs, but when she did, she just couldn't get words out. It was like her chest was so tight she couldn't even speak. And then suddenly, Lauren realized this pressure on her chest was very real, and it was getting worse and worse, to the point where it was genuinely hard to take a breath in. And so Lauren actually said to her kids, "I think I'm having a panic attack." And so her daughter ran to the kitchen to get some water. And as she did, Lauren took a seat on the couch to try to calm down. But by the time her daughter came back with the glass of water, Lauren straight up just could not breathe. I mean, she was trying to pull air in, but it wasn't going in, and she was totally panicking. And so she looked at her kids and just mouthed the words, "I can't breathe." At which point the kids understood, like, this is way beyond just grief and sadness. Like, she's having a physical emergency right now. And so one of Lauren's daughters picked up the phone and called 911. A few minutes later, an ambulance arrived, and they would take Lauren to a local hospital. But as soon as they got there, the doctors and nurses determined that very likely Lauren had had a heart attack. And even though she was basically stable right now, their fear is she was going to have another one. And this particular local hospital just lacked the resources and staff to actually treat Lauren. And so they pretty much immediately transferred Lauren to another hospital called the JW Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, West Virginia, because that hospital had a specialized cardiac care unit for people with very serious heart problems. Dr. Konrad Falinger was the cardiologist on duty at JW Memorial Hospital when Lauren was brought into the intensive care unit, followed closely behind by her 3 adult children. Now, Dr. Falinger was used to seeing worried families in the hospital, but Lauren's kids looked far more distressed than he was used to seeing. And when he spoke to Lauren's kids about, what's going on with Lauren, he would see why. The doctor would learn that this family has lost their father, their husband, just a few hours earlier. And the mother, Lauren, who's this patient, she laid with her dead husband out on the road in a pool of blood. And now these poor kids who've just lost their father, they're seeing their mother go to the ICU for what looks like a heart attack. I mean, this was a total worst case scenario where basically everything was going wrong for this family. Dr. Falinger did his best to push his emotions to the side. He didn't want to get wrapped up emotionally in this case, but at the same time, the doctor felt a very deep need to save Lauren. Like, let this family have one good thing happen to them. But Lauren's condition was pretty dire. Just like the doctors at that local hospital where Lauren went first, Dr. Falinger also suspected Lauren had a heart attack, very likely because of that blood circulation disorder that she had that basically clogged her arteries. When an artery in the heart gets blocked, the blood can't circulate in the heart, and so the heart dies. And preliminary testing on Lauren showed there was already signs of damage to her heart, in the same way that a heart attack would damage a heart. Her heartbeat was also irregular, and it was too fast, and her blood pressure was dangerously low. And then also, when Dr. Falinger looked at some imaging of Lauren's heart, he could see that the majority of her heart muscle wasn't even moving. Basically, Lauren's heart was working way harder and way faster than it should be to accomplish nothing. And so, very quickly, Dr. Falinger realized that unless he was able to find the blocked artery in Lauren's heart and clear it, that Lauren would die. And so Dr. Falinger looked up at Lauren's 3 kids who were just standing there in silence, waiting for more bad news. And Dr. Falinger said to them, "Your mom needs to go into surgery right now." Nurses wheeled Lauren out of the ICU and into surgery, where she was immediately put under anesthesia. Once Lauren was ready, Dr. Falinger watched on a monitor as another surgeon fed a thin, flexible tube called a catheter into an artery in Lauren's leg and then fed it up towards her heart. This surgery was called cardiac angioplasty. Basically, that surgeon was going to use that catheter, that tube, and put it into Lauren's heart and then shoot dye through that catheter tube into the blood in Lauren's heart. And then Dr. Falinger and the other doctors could watch to see where this dye went. If the dye was pumped out of the heart like it should be, they'd see it go in all different directions. But if at some point on the monitor, the dye just stopped inside the heart and didn't go anywhere, then that would mean they found a blockage. And so when the surgeon had the catheter in Lauren's heart, he injected the dye and they all watched on the monitor, and her heart functioned completely fine. There was no blockage in her heart. Now, the doctors weren't entirely convinced yet that there was no blockage, so they pulled that catheter out and they got a different one and they went through the exact procedure all over again to see if maybe that catheter was malfunctioning. But again, that second time, the dye didn't stop anywhere. Her heart seemed to be functioning totally normally. And so Dr. Falinger and the rest of the doctors and surgeons, they were all totally baffled, because what this meant was whatever was happening to Lauren, or whatever did happen to Lauren, was not a heart attack. But make no mistake, Lauren's heart was still absolutely dying. It was just some other thing killing it. Dr. Falinger went back to the drawing board, but realistically, there just weren't that many other things to consider with regards to what was happening to Lauren. Heavy alcohol use could in theory cause what was happening to Lauren, but Lauren didn't drink. Infection was another option, but Lauren showed no signs of having an infection. Certain chemotherapy drugs have been known to damage the heart, but Lauren wasn't on chemo and certainly would not have accidentally been exposed to chemo drugs without knowing about it. And so basically, Dr. Falinger had no clue what was wrong with Lauren, and he didn't even know where to start. And so Dr. Falinger just sat in his office feeling so bad about the fact that, these kids are almost certainly gonna lose their other parent. I mean, it was his duty to save Lauren, and he couldn't do it. And he just felt so bad. He couldn't even imagine how he was gonna deliver the news to the kids that, your mom's gonna die and we don't know why. I mean, this was the worst for Dr. Falinger. He felt like he had failed as a doctor. But just then, Dr. Falinger has this epiphany. He remembers this weird medical article he had read somewhat recently, and he realized what was going on with Lauren and her family was like the same thing that happened in that article. And because Dr. Falinger did not have any other ideas of how to handle what was going on with Lauren, he decided he would just try to do what they did in that article, because if he was wrong, he had nothing to lose. So Dr. Falinger got up and he ran to Lauren's hospital room, and when he got in there, he saw Lauren's kids and he called them over to him, and he would tell them that he's going to give their mom some medication that's going to spike her blood pressure and keep it high, but then he needs them to gather around her and just talk to her like she's your mom. Talk lovingly, soothingly, remind her that you're still here and that everything is okay. And the kids, they all agreed to do this. And then Dr. Falinger, he gave the medicine to Lauren, and then he watched as her 3 kids circled up around the head of the bed, and they're all crying and holding their mom and telling her how much they love her and please come back to us, come back. And as they're doing this, Dr. Falinger just quietly walked out of the room, hoping this would work. And sure enough, just a week later, Lauren was all better. It would turn out the way in which Lauren lost her husband, both the suddenness of getting that phone call, combined with just the unthinkable horror of seeing your loved one on the road in a pool of blood dead. I mean, that situation was so stressful for Lauren that her brain released a ton of stress hormones into her body. So much so that these stress hormones literally paralyzed her heart. And so you can understand why all the doctors thought this was a heart attack, because this sort of looked like one. But this condition does have its own name. It's called stress cardiomyopathy. However, it's known by its more casual name, which is broken heart syndrome. Basically, Lauren loved her husband so much that to witness what happened to him and to learn about it so suddenly and abruptly, it nearly killed her. And it just so happens that a few months before Lauren was checked into the hospital, Dr. Fallinger happened to read a medical article about broken heart syndrome. And the only way you can treat broken heart syndrome is just to try to keep the patient alive long enough that the stress hormones leave their body naturally, at which point their heart goes back to normal. And so Dr. Fallinger was able to buy Lauren a little bit of time right at the end there by giving her that medicine that boosted her blood pressure. But Dr. Fallinger told her 3 kids that really it was up to them to keep their mother alive. They needed to crowd around their mom and just talk to her and tell her that you love her, show her that you're here with her, give her a reason to fight and hold on. Even though she's not saying or doing anything, she's still alive and she can hear you. So talk to her. And so Lauren's kids just sat around their mother and just showered her with love and affection. And sure enough, a few days later, when Lauren did kind of come out of it and recover, she would say that she felt herself drifting off towards death. I mean, she really knew she was dying. But then she remembers hearing her kids calling to her and saying how much they loved her and to please come back. We need you. We already lost Dad. We got to keep you. And Lauren would say that's the reason she's still here today, is because she held on for her kids. She felt like it was her duty to be here for her family. And